Likutey Halakhot on Shulchan Aruch Yoreh De'ah. Rebbe Noson, follower of Rebbe Nachman of Breslov. Laws of Ritual Slaughter. Law 1. Based on the lesson in Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 6. In sum, the essence of repentance is remaining silent while hearing oneself being scorned. This is because prior to repentance, one is in the category of the back of the countenance of Ehyeh, which is numerically equivalent to 44, blood, which is why one must endure disgrace, end, scorn, and bloodshed. The rectification for this is to transform blood to silence, and then remain silent for God and endure for Him. Psalms 37. 7. And He will strike down for you many corpses. End quote. Gittin 7. A meaning that the blood in the left ventricle of the heart is subdued. And when one desires to follow the paths of repentance, one must be skilled in walking, skilled in advancing, and skilled in retreating, corresponding to entering and leaving, as in, if I ascend to heaven, if I lay my bed in hell. Psalms 139, 8. Through silence, a kirik is formed, as in, the earth is my footstool. Isaiah 66, 1. This is a kirik, Tikkuni Zohar 7a, and this becomes Adam, the human being, corresponding to Moses and Joshua. Study the lesson well. Section 1. The purpose of ritual slaughter is to elevate the living human soul incarnated in the animal, which corresponds to repentance, which is to return and restore the soul to its root, and the essence of repentance is silence, to remain silent to one's vilifier and scorner. This can be understood as follows. Who knows that the human spirit ascends on high, and the animal spirit descends below? Ecclesiastes 3:21. And when a person sins, they descend from the human spirit to the animal spirit, and the difference between a human being and an animal is speech, for speech is the defining characteristic of the human being. Hence, when a person sins on account of which they descend to the animal spirit, they are then in the category of a lack of speech, like an animal. Therefore, their rectification is through that itself, through silence, through bearing the pain of silence, for one must rectify in that in which one has blemished. Since one has blemished and caused through one's sins to descend to the level of an animal, which is a lack of speech, one must therefore be punished by bearing the pain of silence, through which one will be rectified and refined, thereby rectifying what one has blemished. And when one has been rectified by remaining silent for God, this brings about a human being. One is restored to the distinction of a human being, which is one's rectification. For one ascends from the level of animal to the level of human being. This corresponds to the ritual slaughter. The human soul that did not repent during its earthly lifetime is forced to return as an animal, literally, because it had drawn upon itself an animal spirit on account of its sins. Woe to that shame! Woe to that disgrace! And when a human soul is incarnated in an animal body, its rectification is through ritual slaughter, for the bloodshedding of the slaughter corresponds to the bloodshedding of shame. For the human soul is then certainly in the category of silence, when it is brought to the slaughter as a lamb. Isaiah 53, 7. But through the slaughter knife, the soul is elevated to the lower point, which corresponds to God's sword. Isaiah 34, 6, as in, an avenging sword. Leviticus 26, 25, which corresponds to the Malkut, which corresponds to the lower point, which corresponds to Joshua, as in, beneath his feet was, Exodus 24, 10, which corresponds to the moon, all of which correspond to the Malkut, which corresponds to the slaughter knife. But then, when the soul ascends, which corresponds to repentance, the upper point takes form, and then Adam takes form. and the soul ascends from the category of animal to the category of human, which is its rectification. This corresponds to the blessing over the slaughter. For now, the soul is restored to the category of human, which is speech. Section 2. This corresponds to the exodus from Egypt. At that time, speech was in exile, for speech had then fell into the narrow of the throat, and the redemption came about through the divine name Ehyeh, as written, Ehyeh has sent me to you. Exodus 3:14. Hence, in Egypt, the back of the countenance of Ehyeh, numerically blood, Aleph, Aleph He, Aleph He Yod, Aleph He Yod He, equals 44, was functioning as written, I passed over you, and I saw you wallowing in your blood. Ezekiel 16:6. Etz Chaim 16:3. And when the people left Egypt, the name Ehyeh was revealed in proper sequence, the bloods were rectified, speech ascended from the narrow of the throat, and they entered the category of human beings. This is why ritual slaughter is done at the point of the narrow of the throat, in order to elevate the soul from there, for to there it has fallen, and now we are elevating it from there, from the narrow of the throat. This corresponds to the prohibition of tarrying during the slaughter, which corresponds to, for they were chased out of Egypt and were unable to tarry. Exodus 12:39. For when they left Egypt, they could not tarry or delay their stay there at all, so that the forces of evil would not intensify. Similarly, when we extract the holy soul from the animal through ritual slaughter, which corresponds literally to the exodus from Egypt, we must not tarry or delay at all, so that the forces of evil will not intensify during that delay. Section 3. But chopping off the head is also disqualified, for the slaughter must be done in a back and forth motion. Yoreh De'ah 24:1-2. For though we must not tarry or delay, nevertheless, we must also not hasten the hour, and we cannot extract the soul forcefully all at once. Rather, we must pass through the narrow of the throat in order to elevate from there all of the sparks of the soul, for this is repentance. We must be skilled in walking, skilled in advancing, and skilled in retreating, corresponding to entering and leaving, meaning that whoever wants to repent cannot come suddenly close to holiness until they have passed through all of the places in which they have previously been through, becoming refined and purified there, so that they elevate from there all of the sparks that had fallen there because of them. This is entering and leaving. This corresponds to the slaughter having to be done in a back and forth motion, corresponding to advancing and retreating. The slaughter must not be done by chopping off the head in one fell blow, for we must not hasten the hour to extract the soul all at once. Rather, we must pass through the narrow of the throat in a back and forth motion, corresponding to advancing and retreating, in order to elevate from there all of the sparks of the soul. Only then is the slaughter kosher. Section 4. The slaughter knife corresponds to God's sword, which corresponds to the Malkut, which corresponds to the lower point, as in, Joshua's face is like the face of the moon, Bava Batra. 75a, which corresponds to, beneath his feet was the appearance of a brick of sapphire, Exodus 24:10. That is why the knife must not be blemished with the slightest nick, which would correspond to the blemish of the moon from which the forces of evil are nourished. Rather, the nick must be filled by sharpening the knife, filling it so that it will no longer be blemished. But the ultimate rectification of the knife is the mind, the intellect, for the knife must be checked by the intellect. Yoreh De'ah 18:17. In other words, the knife, which corresponds to the lower point, to the moon, is rectified and filled by the intellect, which corresponds to Moses, who corresponds to the upper point, which corresponds to the sun, as in, Moses' face is like the face of the sun, and when the knife is whole, without blemish, then the soul is able to ascend, For the ultimate rectification comes through the filling of the moon. Section 5. Based on the above, we can offer some explanation to what the Rebbe writes in Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 278, that all the temple vessels can be seen in a good slaughter knife. This is because the slaughter knife corresponds to the lower point, to Joshua, which corresponds to annihilating the descendants of Amalek, and Moses corresponds to the upper point, which corresponds to the temple, and as the upper point shines into and is revealed in the lower point, in which all colors appear, similarly in the slaughter knife, which corresponds to the lower point, appear the temple and its vessels, which correspond to the upper point. The slaughter knife also corresponds to the annihilation of the descendants of Amalek, and therefore with it we slaughter the animal and subdue the animal spirit, which corresponds to Amalek, for the Amalekites transformed themselves to look like animals. Rashi, on 1 Samuel 15:3. Law 2. Regarding slaughter and checking the knife. Section 1. A blemish in the slaughter knife is caused by the realm of death, and the holy Jewish people must not eat a carcass of an animal that has died naturally through the angel of death and has come under the dominion of the realm of death. This corresponds to a blemish in the covenant, as written, "You shall not eat any carcass, for you are a holy people." Deuteronomy 14:21. Wherever you find fence around lewdness. Leviticus Rabbah 24:6. Meaning that, since the Jewish people are a holy people, corresponding to guardians of the covenant, which is the essence of Jewish holiness, therefore, they may not eat a carcass, which corresponds to the realm of death, to a blemish in the covenant, in contrast to the guarding of the covenant, from which life emerges. Similarly, when there is a blemish in the slaughter knife, this blemish rips the windpipe and esophagus, and the animal then does not die on account of the slaughter, but on account of the ripping of the passageways caused by the blemish in the knife, which is caused by the realm of death. Then it becomes a carcass that must not be eaten by the holy Jewish people. This is because an animal becomes kosher for eating specifically through slaughter with a kosher knife, through which the animal spirit is subdued and the animal soul is elevated to a speaking soul. This is because the slaughter knife corresponds to God's sword is filled with blood. Isaiah 34:6, as the Rebbe writes, Likutey Moharan, Part 1. 37, which corresponds to the wholeness of the holy tongue, which corresponds to Eve woman, which corresponds to this sword that consumes and destroys everything. Specifically, the evil of the 70 nations that correspond to a blemish in the covenant, to the animal spirit, whereas the Jewish people who cleave to the covenant receive life from it, as written, "But you who cleave to God are living." Deuteronomy 4:4. This corresponds to the ritual slaughter to subdue and break the power of animality, the evil of the 70 nations, the realm of death, the blemish of the covenant, and the rectification and enlivening of the soul of the living creature, elevating it from animal to human, for the life force of the soul that is in the animal is actualized by elevating it to its root, to the human being. This is because God's sword that is filled with blood corresponds to the wholeness of the holy tongue, which is the all-encompassing lust, which subdues the collective evil of the 70 nations, as in, "Praises of God are in their throat, and a double-bladed sword is in their hand, to execute vengeance upon the nations." Psalms 149:6. Praises of God corresponds to the wholeness of the holy tongue, which corresponds to prayer, and the wholeness of the holy tongue corresponds to double, as in twice scripture, see Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 19. Then this is, to execute vengeance upon the nations, through which we subdue the evil of the 70 nations. This is why we must keep the slaughter knife, which corresponds to God's sword, free of all blemishes which come from the realm of death, from a blemish in the covenant which blemishes the knife. God's sword, for the two are interdependent, the wholeness of the holy tongue and the guarding of the covenant, and on account of a blemish in the covenant, the speech of the holy tongue is blemished, which corresponds to a blemish in the slaughter knife. Section 2. This corresponds to the 12 signs for which the slaughter knife must be checked. Yoreh De'ah 18:9, which correspond to the 12 tribes of God upon whom the holy Malkut stands. For they correspond to the rectification of the covenant, and for the same reason there are 12 words in the blessing over the slaughter. This is because the slaughter knife, God's sword, must be carefully checked to be without any blemish, as in, "You are entirely beautiful, my beloved, and there is no blemish in you." Song of Songs 4:7 for the holy tongue, which corresponds to Eve woman, must be in great wholeness, without the slightest blemish. Since a blemish in the slaughter knife is like a blemish in the altar chulin 17b, this is because the slaughter knife must correspond to the wholeness of the holy tongue, and must therefore not be blemished, but be whole as the wholeness of the altar, as in, "You shall build it of whole stones," Deuteronomy 27:6, from where we learn the disqualification of a blemished altar. Similarly, the knife corresponds to the speech of the holy tongue, and must therefore not be blemished, but be whole of the altar, as in, "You shall build it of whole stones," which corresponds to the wholeness of the speech of the holy tongue, as the Rebbe says elsewhere, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1:18. This is because the stones correspond to letters, as stated in the Sefer Yetzirah, chapter 4. 2 stones build 2 houses, and they must therefore be whole, without blemish, as in the wholeness of the holy tongue, which corresponds to the slaughter knife. This is because the altar is also a rectification of the covenant through the sacrificial offerings that subdue the animal spirit. That is why a blemish in the slaughter knife is the same as a blemish in the stones of the altar, and why the acronym of Avanim Shlemot Tivneh, "You shall build it of whole stones," is Aishet woman, as the Rebbe writes elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1:18 for this corresponds to the wholeness of the holy tongue, which corresponds to Eve woman. Thus, the knife must be checked over one's skin and nail Yoreh De'ah 18:9, which corresponds to the wholeness of the holy tongue through the Targum. Flesh corresponds to the holy tongue, as in Eve woman, since "she is flesh from my flesh," Genesis 2:23, and the nail corresponds to Targum, which corresponds to the Noga, since the nails correspond to garments of leather, Breshit Rabbah 20:12, which corresponds to the Kashmal, which corresponds to Targum. Hence, skin and nail correspond to the wholeness of the holy tongue through the Targum, through which the slaughter knife, which corresponds to speech, to God's sword, is checked. All blemishes in the knife, which correspond to the realm of death, a blemish in the covenant, must be checked and removed, subdued through the holy tongue, through the Targum. Section 3. This is why even the slightest blemish in the slaughter knife should be avoided, and a blemish as deep as a hair's breadth disqualifies the knife according to all opinions. Yoreh De'ah 18:2. This corresponds to God is exacting with the righteous even to a hair's breadth, Yevamot 121b, and a tzaddik is one who guards the covenant, Zohar, Part 1:59b. And regarding the guarding of the covenant, God is exacting to a hair's breadth, such that one must guard oneself from the slightest blemish in this tzaddik, which corresponds to the guarding of the covenant. This is because the guarding of the covenant is the rectification of the mind, and the mind must be carefully guarded from even the slightest blemish, since it is the root of everything, as we have written in the laws of Pesach, Law 1. Because a blemish in the mind corresponds to leavened dough on Pesach, the slightest amount of which is forbidden. Therefore, a blemish in the slaughter knife of a hair's breadth is definitely disqualifying, since the hairs are the extraneous matter of the mind, and when the mind is blemished, this blemish affects the hair the most, for they grow out of the turbidness of the mind. Thus, the mind must be carefully guarded, so that it is not blemished at all, so that even one single hair will not become blemished at all. For the tzaddik, whose mind is holy, even his hairs which are the extraneous matter of the mind, are also holy. This corresponds to a blemish in the slaughter knife, which corresponds to a blemish in the covenant being a hair's breadth, which means that even one single hair of one's head, corresponding to the extraneous matter of the mind, should not become blemished. Section 4. This is why ritual slaughter is only kosher when done by a Jewish person, whereas slaughter by a non-Jew is considered a carcass, even that of a non-idolatrous non-Jew, and even if it is a minor with adults overseeing him. Yoreh De'ah 2:1. For on the contrary, a non-Jew inevitably renders the slaughtered animal a carcass, since the non-Jew is from the 70 nations that are sunk in the all-encompassing evil, and slaughter is kosher only when done by a Jewish person, since all Jewish people are in the category of guarding the covenant and have the power to subdue the all-encompassing evil of the 70 nations, as written, "Your people Israel are all righteous." Isaiah 60:21. Section 5. This is also why our sages said that one must not slaughter before showing one's knife to a sage to check it for him, for the wholeness of the holy tongue, which corresponds to God's sword, to the slaughter knife, can only be received from the tzaddik and sage of the generation who has attained the wholeness of the holy tongue, as explained in the lesson. That is why one must receive specifically from them the slaughter knife, which corresponds to the speech of the wholeness of the holy tongue. Related to earlier. Section 6. One must thus be fluent in the 5 laws of slaughter, Yoreh De'ah 23, 1 corresponding to the Hey 5 of Hadat, knowledge, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 53, which corresponds to the rectification of the covenant, through which the slaughter is kosher. This corresponds to the slaughterer having to be fluent in the laws, and that his skill has been established. Yoreh De'ah 1:1 fluency corresponds to wholeness in the 5 laws of slaughter, which correspond to the rectification of the covenant, as said, and established that he is not weak-hearted and will not faint in the middle. For one must be strong-hearted and firm to hold on firmly to God's sword, to fight God's battles, subduing the all-encompassing evil, the spirit of animality, through the slaughter. For the rectification of the covenant corresponds to audacity, as in Boaz in him is courage, Tikkuni Zohar 31. Section 7. This is why an animal must not be slaughtered before 8 days after birth, just as a sacrificial offering, regarding which is written, 7 days it shall be with its mother, and from the 8th day onward it is acceptable as an offering. Leviticus 22:29. This is because sacrifices correspond to the rectification of the covenant, since they come to subdue and dispel the spirit of animality, so they are not acceptable before the 8th day, as in circumcision, which is the rectification of the covenant, which must be done on the 8th day. This is because the very essence of the rectification of the covenant corresponds to the 8th day, which is beyond the 7 days, corresponding to Dot, through which the rectification of the covenant can be attained. So 7 days must pass before circumcision in order to go beyond the power of imagination, the power of animality, which is attached to the 7 days through fallen love's Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 54. Whereas the 8th day, which corresponds to the mind, is beyond its power. It is then that the circumcision is done to subdue the animality and to rectify the covenant. Similarly, regarding the sacrificial offering, which is also unacceptable before the 8th day, since it too corresponds to the rectification of the covenant, and slaughter itself also corresponds to the rectification of the covenant, to a sacrifice that subdues the power of animality. So, we must wait for the 8th day after birth before slaughtering any animal. As the Rebbe writes in Lesson 19, the subdual of the all-encompassing evil is attained through the wholeness of the holy tongue, which corresponds to circumcision, to chashmal, which corresponds to the slaughter knife, as in a double-edged sword, which corresponds to the wholeness of the holy tongue. Hence, Since it corresponds to circumcision, we must therefore wait until the 8th day. Section 8. This corresponds to covering the blood with earth, specifically with earth, which corresponds to a sword, as said, which corresponds to prayer, to the Malkut, to the speech of the wholeness of the holy tongue, all of which corresponds to earth, which corresponds to prayer, and to a sword, as the Rebbe writes elsewhere, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1. 9 as in, let him render his sword as earth, Isaiah 41. 2, as the Rebbe says on, he took earth, for earth corresponds to the Malkut. Therefore, the covering of the blood, though it is a separate commandment, is considered the completion of the slaughter, since it literally corresponds to slaughter and completes it. This is because the slaughter is with a knife, through which we subdue the spirit of animality, as in, a sword that avenges the vengeance of the covenant, Leviticus 26. 25, as in, my sword will consume flesh, Deuteronomy 32, 42, for it consumes everything. And through the slaughter itself with a sword, we rectify and revive the soul that is in the animal, as in, but you who cleave to your God are living, Deuteronomy 4:4. And this itself corresponds to the covering of the blood, which is to rectify the remnants of the sparks and souls still remaining in the blood itself, for the blood is the soul there, 12:23. And, as our sages said, blood with which the soul comes out, Pesachim 16b. So we must cover it with earth, which corresponds to a sword, in order to wipe out transgression and put an end to sin, Daniel 9:24, in order to refine and purify the soul that is in it, to subdue the evil that surrounds it, to eradicate it through the earth, which corresponds to a sword, and to rectify and elevate the soul that is in it to its root, and to thereby revive it. That is why the one who has done the slaughter is the one who should cover the blood, Yoreh De'ah 28:8, for it is literally part of the slaughter and its completion. So, the one who has begun a mitzvah, begun to rectify the souls through the slaughter knife, must complete it by covering the blood with earth. All this is accomplished through the rectification of the covenant, through which the slaughter and the covering are accomplished. This is why, when the slaughter is invalid, there is no need to cover the blood, Yoreh De'ah 28:17. For when the main rectification of the slaughter was not accomplished, it is therefore impossible to rectify the remaining souls left in the blood through covering, for the realm of death has already taken hold of them, since the animal has become a carcass. The rectification of the covering can only be completed when the rectification of the slaughter has been properly achieved. Hence, the covering of the blood is accomplished through the rectification of the covenant. Section 9. This is why the earth must be placed beneath and on top of the blood, which is derived from the verse, he shall cover it with earth, Leviticus 17:13. This corresponds to burial, which is also for the rectification and elevation of the soul, and dissolving the filth and subduing the evil attached to it. As written, the earth will return to the ground from where it came, and the spirit will return to God, Ecclesiastes 12:7. Burial is essentially for the purpose of the rectification of the covenant, which itself corresponds to covering the genital flesh, for that is where evil becomes attached to, on account of a blemish in the covenant, and from there arise all disgraces and embarrassments, as in, it is a disgrace for us, Genesis 34:14. This is why the disgrace must be covered up immediately and buried as soon as possible, as written, you shall bury it on that very day. For to leave it hanging would be a curse to God. Deuteronomy 21:23. Curse in the sense of dishonor and disgrace, as Rashi explains. In other words, in order to cover the disgrace that hovers over the soul on account of a blemish in the covenant, the body must be buried quickly, for, from the very beginning, the decree of death and burial was on account of a blemish in the covenant, as written, for you are earth, and you shall return to the earth, Genesis 3:19, which was said to Adam, who blemished the covenant. As our sages said, Adam pulled his foreskin, Sanhedrin 38b, on account of which we must specifically bury the body in order to cover the disgrace. And this is a great benefit and rectification, dissolving the filth and elevating the soul, as we find that in reward for Shem and Japhet covering their father's nakedness, which corresponds to a rectification of the covenant, their descendants were given burial, which corresponds to covering the disgrace, as said. This corresponds to the covering of the blood with earth, which is with earth beneath and above, which corresponds to a rectification of a blemish in the covenant, which is the cause of the oppressed souls having entered into the animal that has now been slaughtered. That is why the blood requires the same covering as a burial, in order to cover the soul's disgrace, to thereby rectify and elevate it and dissolve its filth. Section 10. This is why the blood of animals and birds require covering Yoreh De'ah 28. 1. For the oppressed souls are trapped mostly in them, as in a captured beast or bird, Leviticus 17:13, for they are always captured, since their vitality is in the category of captured, as written, as birds caught in the trap and as fish caught in the net, Ecclesiastes 9:12, which refers to the oppressed souls. Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 37. That is why the blood of their souls needs to be rectified by covering. Section 11. This is why beasts and birds are naturally swift, and their agility, vitality, and intelligence is greater than that of domesticated animals, because they are closer to the level of human being, and there are more sparks and vitality of human souls in them than in animals. For this reason, the Jewish people are more frequently compared to beasts than to animals, as written, "Your beasts will dwell in it." Psalm 68:11. This corresponds to, "Do not give the soul of your dove to the beast. Look to the covenant." Psalms 74, 19-20, where we beseech of God to compassionately see to the rectification of the covenant and to rescue the holy souls from the beasts, so that they not become trapped by them. Their very name attests to this, for they are called chayot, beasts, on account of the chayut, vitality, that is within them, since their vitality comes from human vitality. Animals, however, are called after the animal spirit that is more prominent in them than in beasts. This is why sacrificial offerings come only from animals, for sacrifices are brought to atone and eradicate spiritual filth from the world, so they must be brought specifically from animals in order to subdue it. Through the ritual leaning on the sacrificial animal before slaughter, the spirit of defilement is transferred to the animal, that is, the power of animality that had become embodied in the human being on account of sin, which is accomplished specifically by the spirit of animality being so intense in the animal, which is why it attracts to itself the power of animality from the human being, for everything is attracted to its source. Then, through the sacrifice, the spirit of animality is subdued and dissolved. This is why the sign offering which comes to atone for a sin and which achieves greater atonement than a burnt offering, for a burnt offering is only brought for a sin in thought, is brought from a lower level of animal than which the burnt offering is brought. The sign offering is brought from a female and the burnt offering from a male, for the sign offering must eradicate greater animality. And because more souls are trapped in beasts and birds than in animals, therefore even after slaughter, there are still souls left in the soul blood that gushes forth, which is why this blood must be covered, as said. Section 12. This corresponds to the earth of the suspected adulteress, who is checked with earth, for earth, which corresponds to an avenging sword, avenging the covenant, checks her. If she has been defiled, then the sword uproots and consumes her. But if she is undefiled, then, on the contrary, she receives vitality and power from the earth, as in, "But you who cleave to your God are alive today," Deuteronomy 4:4, as said. Law 3. Based on the lesson in Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 14. Study there the entire lesson. In sum, one must elevate glory to its root, which is awe, and elevating glory is achieved through the Torah of loving kindness, for through the Torah we arouse the roots of souls that arose first in divine thought. Through this, they shine into each other, thereby arousing the souls of Jewish sinners, through which they are aroused to repent, through which souls of proselytes are aroused, through which the very distant ones, the penitents and the proselytes, come forward to approach God. Through this, God's glory is elevated and exalted, for His greatest glory is when the distant ones come close to Him. But one cannot attain Torah other than through humility, and when one restores glory to its root, which is awe, then the blemishes in awe are filled, and one attains peace. For where there is awe, there is wholeness. Zohar, Part 2, 79a, as written, those who fear Him lack nothing. Psalms 34:10. Then one is able to pray, for prayer comes in place of a sacrifice. And regarding a sacrifice, it is written, any animal in which there is a blemish shall not be brought. Leviticus 22:20. And when there is no blemish, which is when there is awe, then one is able to perform one's service in wholeness. Section 1. This corresponds to ritual slaughter. The essence of the slaughter is achieved through awe, which corresponds to the slaughter knife, which corresponds to might and judgments, as in 60 warriors, all of them holding swords. Song of Songs 3, 7-8, which corresponds to awe. As at the end of the lesson, the Rebbe writes on the verse, they shall speak of your might, Psalms 145, 11, that Gevurah corresponds to awe. This corresponds to a multi-bladed sword, there, 149, 6, which is the slaughter knife. That is why the slaughter knife must be free of any blemish, that there will be no lack of wholeness or nick in it at all. Yoreh De'ah 18:2-4. Where there is awe, there is wholeness, as written, those who fear Him lack nothing. So the slaughter knife must be whole, without any blemish, so that it will correspond to awe, which corresponds to wholeness without any blemish, since those who fear Him lack nothing. This is because the slaughter renders the meat kosher for Jewish eating, and Jewish eating is in place of a sacrifice. As our sages said, the table atones as the altar. Brachot 55a. That is why the meat can only be made kosher for eating through awe, which corresponds to the slaughter knife having to be whole without any blemish. Only then can it render the meat kosher for Jewish eating, which corresponds to a sacrifice. As explained in the lesson, the correspondence of a sacrifice to prayer is through awe, which corresponds to wholeness without blemish. For any animal with a blemish shall not be brought, for eating is in place of a sacrifice. That is why we must not eat before prayers. Orach Chaim 89:3 derived from the verse, do not eat over blood. Leviticus 19a. 26. Do not eat before praying for your own blood. Brachot 10b. For only after praying for one's blood, which corresponds to a sacrifice, can we eat with a holiness that corresponds to a sacrifice? Section 2. Hence, the slaughter knife corresponds to awe, and where there is awe, there is wholeness, so the knife must therefore be completely whole without any blemish. That is why the slaughterer must receive this whole knife, specifically from a Torah scholar. For as our sages said, the slaughterer must show his knife to a sage, for it is impossible for the slaughterer to attain a whole knife that corresponds to complete awe, through which the blemishes of the knife will be made whole, other than through an authentic sage who is devoted to Torah. Through his Torah study with holiness, he arouses the roots of Jewish souls, through which he arouses penitents and proselytes, through which he elevates glory from the disgrace of exile, through which he fills the blemishes in awe, and attains complete awe, from which he evokes the wholeness of the slaughter knife without any blemish. That is why the slaughterer must receive this perfect knife for slaughter specifically from an authentic sage, for the ultimate wholeness of the knife, which corresponds to awe, is brought about through the elevation of glory that ascends through the Torah of loving kindness of the authentic sage. This corresponds to, "You shall slaughter as I have instructed you," Deuteronomy 12:21, "as I have instructed you," refers to the totality of Torah and the commandments. In other words, to the extent of the Torah study of the authentic sage, so do we attain a perfect slaughter knife, which corresponds to awe. This corresponds to the 5 laws of slaughter, Yoreh De'ah 23:1, which correspond to the 5 books of the Torah, which corresponds to the totality of the Torah. For through the totality of the Torah, which contains all Jewish souls, is kosher slaughter achieved. For through the Torah is glory elevated and awe perfected, which corresponds to the whole slaughter knife without blemish. That is why the slaughterer himself must also possess a portion in the Torah, which is why the slaughter of an apostate or a non-Jew is not kosher, even if Jews are witnessing that he is slaughtering properly, and even if the slaughterer is not actually an idolater. This is because slaughter itself corresponds to the elevation of glory to its root in awe, which corresponds to the slaughter knife. For the essence of slaughter is to elevate the souls that have become incarnated in animals, beasts, and birds. And these souls are Jewish souls that have fallen on account of their blemishes and sins, on account of which they reincarnated in animals and are wallowing the depths of exile in those animals. But through the slaughter, we elevate them from there, which is why the slaughterer must have a portion in the Torah, and why we must be very particular to find an upright and God-fearing slaughterer. For the more upright a person he is, the greater portion he has in the Torah. For the essence of slaughter, which is to elevate the souls from the depths of exile, is through the Torah. This is the meaning of our sages' teaching. Anyone in the Torah of slaughter, literally anyone obligated in the commandment of slaughter, is fitting to slaughter. Tosafot, Yom Tov, Chulin 1:1 specifically in the Torah of slaughter, for he must possess a portion in the Torah so that he will have the power to sort out and elevate the souls, which corresponds to elevating glory to its root, which is awe, which corresponds to the slaughter knife, which corresponds to perfect awe. This corresponds to the requirement to check the knife even after the slaughter, Yoreh De'ah 18:12. The slaughter should actually make the knife even more perfect, since through the slaughter we are extracting these souls, who are parts of the glory, through which awe, which corresponds to the knife, is perfected. However, these fallen souls that have reincarnated in animals correspond to half, as explained in the lesson. For they have many hindrances and must bear great toil before they are able to ascend to holiness, since the garments soiled by excrement that they are wearing prevent and obstruct them from holiness. That is why we are very stringent regarding ritual slaughter, and any doubt renders the animal non-kosher, for great toils are required to elevate these souls that have reincarnated in animals, which corresponds to the garments soiled by excrement that have been given to them. We must strip them of these filthy garments and elevate them and sort them out of the animal bodies. But great toils are required to achieve this, since they have many obstacles, as said. And the very requirement of assuring that the slaughter is properly kosher is itself a great toil, so that the obstacles do not prevent the souls from ascending by making the slaughter non-kosher. That is why any doubt in the slaughter renders the animal non-kosher, since through the slaughter we are extracting and elevating the souls from the obstacles that any doubt or blemish is found in it. The slaughter is rendered non-kosher, for perhaps it became blemished in the skin of the animal or bird, which corresponds to the excrement-stained garments, which are the cause of all the obstacles. Thus, even with birds, we say perhaps the knife was blemished by the bird's skin, even though this is very unlikely. Section 3. This is why the slaughter is done specifically at the neck, in the middle of the elongation of the neck. This corresponds to the elongation of the neck, mentioned in the lesson as alluding to haughtiness, as in, they speak with a stiff neck, Psalms 75:6. So the slaughter must take place there, to slaughter and subdue the elongation of the neck, which corresponds to haughtiness. For the elevation of the soul is attained through the negation of haughtiness, as the Rebbe explains in the lesson. For indeed, the ultimate cause for the soul to fall is haughtiness, which is the ultimate cause of all spiritual falls. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 168. Since any fall is caused by haughtiness, this is because there is actuality no such thing as a fall at all, for God is everywhere, since the entire earth is filled with His glory, Isaiah 6:3. But when one is haughty, then God says, I cannot be together with that person, Sotah 5a. Hence, all falls are caused by haughtiness. Thus, these souls that have fallen so greatly such that they have reincarnated in animals, their fall was ultimately caused by haughtiness. So the ultimate rectification of these souls is through humility, which is the essence of the revival of the dead and the ultimate delight of the world of the future, as in, awaken and sing, O dwellers of the earth, Isaiah 26:19. One who has become a neighbor to the earth during their lifetime. Likutey Moharan, Part 2, 72. That is why ritual slaughter, which is for the purpose of rectifying and elevating the soul, is done at the neck in order to subdue and dissolve haughtiness, which corresponds to the elongation of the neck. Section 4. This corresponds to the covering of the blood with earth Yoreh De'ah 28, which corresponds to humility, as in, I am earth and ashes. Genesis 18:27, which Abraham said out of humility, on account of which the Jewish people were privileged to receive the commandment of covering the blood with the earth Sotah 17a. For the ultimate rectification of the soul is through humility. Section 5. This corresponds to a pause in the slaughter that renders the slaughter non-kosher Yoreh De'ah 23, as well as one does a chopping off of the head there, 24. This is because the slaughter must be completed with dexterity and without any pause, for the excrement, stained garments that cause all obstacles might otherwise intensify and obstruct or damage the slaughter. So we must not make any pause at all during the slaughter. The slaughter must be done with greatest dexterity, without the slightest pause. Yet nevertheless, chopping off the head also disqualifies the slaughter. For though great dexterity is required for the slaughter, that is, for the elevation of the souls and stripping them of the excrement-stained garments nevertheless, this cannot be accomplished in one swift blow, for these souls must inevitably bear toil and obstacles, passing through all the obstacles until we are able to strip them of all the excrement-stained garments, which are the obstacles which cannot be subdued all at once, as one chops off a head, Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 14. This corresponds to the disqualification of the slaughter if the slaughter knife was concealed inside the animal. The slaughter must be done completely open and visible, and the knife must not be concealed beneath the skin or between the two organs, so that the excrement, stained garments will not cover the knife, which corresponds to the obstacles and barriers posed by these garments, which correspond to the animal's skin, for slaughter is accomplished through awe, and awe corresponds to the supernal doorway, so the slit of the slaughter must be completely open without any obstacle or obstruction. Section 6. This corresponds to slitting the majority of the two vital signs being sufficient for slaughter, Yoreh De'ah 21:1. Prior to rectification, the souls correspond to half, as explained in the lesson, so their rectification is achieved by their ascending to awe, which corresponds to wholeness. For their ultimate rectification is to elevate them from the category of half, of lacking, to the category of complete awe. That is why slaughter by slitting a majority of the vital signs is sufficient, for the fallen souls correspond to the souls trapped in the scales, and the scales corresponds to half, for it is half good and half evil, which corresponds to a balanced scale that leans toward neither direction, for it is half good and half evil, and neither side is decisive. Thus, a human being is also judged by the majority, as our sages said, Kiddushin 40b. For as soon as one leans a bit to the side of merit, even just a hair's breadth, one enters into the side of good and is considered completely good. This corresponds to those who surround him are measured stringently. Psalms 53. Those who surround him corresponds to the scales, which corresponds to noga, as in noga surrounding it. Ezekiel 1:4, where everything is dependent upon a hair's breadth, as in measured stringently. That is why the slaughter is kosher with a majority of the signs. For through the hair's breadth that makes it a majority are the souls able to take leave of the category of half from the category of the scales. Since they are now leaning toward the side of merit on account of the majority, now they are in the category of good, as in complete awe, which corresponds to the whole slaughter knife. Section 7. This is why our sages said, a boor should not eat meat, Pesachim 49b, for it is impossible to eat meat without Torah study, through which we are able to elevate the souls from the depths of exile. Law 4. The following is based on the lesson in Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 37, where the Rebbe speaks about ritual slaughter in paragraph 6. Study there the entire lesson well. The main idea of the lesson is that one must subdue matter to form. Subdue matter and body, which correspond to animal, to foolishness, to darkness, to death, to forgetfulness, to foreign wisdom, and intensify and elevate the soul and the form, which correspond to life, to memory, to the human, to wisdom, to light, to Torah wisdom. This is attained through a fast, which corresponds to charity, and the greatest charity is for the land of Israel, which corresponds to the sinless breath of young school children. For the ultimate amelioration of judgment, which corresponds to darkness, forgetfulness, and foolishness, and so forth, is through the sinless breath of young school children. This corresponds to ritual slaughter, which corresponds to the elevation of the soul, to subdue the spirit of animality, which corresponds to the animal, to the body, elevating the soul of the animal, to the speaker, which corresponds to the human, to Torah. Study what is said at the end of the lesson, paragraph 7, regarding the sons of the ignorant and all the Torah that they reveal is all a revelation for the slaughterer. Study all this well. Section 1. This corresponds to the 5 laws of ritual slaughter, Yoreh De'ah 23, 1 which correspond to the 5 levels of the soul, which correspond to the 5 types of blood, which correspond to the 5 letters of Mansapach, as brought in the lesson, all of which must be rectified by the slaughter. That is why there are 5 laws of slaughter, corresponding to the 5 levels of the soul, and when we avoid the 5 things that disqualify the slaughter, we thereby are able to elevate the soul from the animal to the human, which is comprised of 5 levels. Section 2. This is why the slaughterer must show his knife to a sage, as our sages said, Chulin 17b, for the ultimate rectification of slaughter, which is to elevate the soul, is achieved specifically through the Torah sage. This is because the holy soul corresponds to Torah wisdom, and therefore the rectification of the slaughter can only be achieved by a sage who is wise in Torah wisdom, for only through Torah wisdom is it possible to elevate the soul. That is why the slaughterer must receive his knife, specifically from a sage, so that he will receive from him the power to rectify what the slaughter is supposed to rectify, which is to elevate the soul, which is impossible to achieve other than through a sage who is wise in Torah wisdom. Furthermore, by showing his knife to the sage, he is thereby showing his honor to him. And as explained in the lesson, another reason for showing his knife to the sage is to honor him. And the elevation of the soul is ultimately achieved through holy honor, which is the root of everything, the root of the Torah and the soul. Therefore he must show his knife to the sage out of honor for the sage, and then the slaughter attains a portion in holy honor, as in, "Those who honor me will I honor," 1 Samuel 2:30. Through this, he is able to rectify and elevate the soul in the animal, for the ultimate elevation of the soul is through holy honor, which is the root of all souls. This is why the slaughter of a non-Jew is not kosher, even if they do not worship idols. Yoreh De'ah 2. 1. For the rectification of the slaughter is to elevate the soul, which corresponds to the Torah, and therefore only a Jew who has a portion in the Torah is able to actualize this rectification, but not a non-Jew, an apostate Jew, since they have left the fold. Their slaughter is not kosher, for the rectification of slaughter must be done specifically by someone who has a portion in the Torah, which is an upright Jew. Then this person has the power to elevate the soul, which corresponds to the Torah. Section 3. This corresponds to, "You shall not slaughter it and its offspring on the same day." Leviticus 22:28. All souls in animals, beasts, and birds are indeed literally human souls that have incarnated in them, and the ultimate rectification of slaughter is to elevate the soul in the creature that has fallen from its stature on account of its sins, from human to animal, to rectify it and restore it to its stature, elevating it from animal to human. That is why the slaughterer must be a very upright and God-fearing person, taking utmost care to recite the blessing over the slaughter with great devotion, and being very careful in all the laws of slaughter, so that he will be able to rectify the soul and elevate it to its stature, from animal to human. That is why there are 5 laws regarding slaughter, corresponding to the 5 books of the Torah, which are the totality of the entire Torah. For the ultimate purpose of the entire Torah is to elevate the soul, which corresponds to the human being, which is what slaughter is supposed to do. This rectification of elevating and sorting out the soul from animal to human, which corresponds to slaughter, we are involved in doing all the days of our lives, every single day and in every single generation, until the coming of the Messiah, when everything will be fully sorted. For it is impossible to rectify and sort everything out in one day, but every single day and in every single generation, we must make unique sortings out until everything will be completed in the days of the Messiah. In sum, no day resembles another, and God in His compassion continuously renews the entire creation, such that on every single day there are unique sortings out to be accomplished that cannot be accomplished on another day, and the same with every single generation. This is why the exile is so lengthy until all the sortings out will be completed. And this is why every human being is obligated to have children, for it is impossible to complete the sorting out other than over the generations. For in each generation there are unique sortings out to accomplish. According to the generation, for every single day is like a unique generation. As our sages said in the Midrash on the verse, "A generation comes and a generation goes." Ecclesiastes 1:4. There is no day on which 600,000 people do not die, and on which the same number is not born. Hence, on every single day, a new generation of 600,000 souls comes into the world. For no generation is less than 600,000. This explains the juxtaposition in Ecclesiastes of "the sun rises and the sun sets" to "a generation goes and a generation comes." For just as the sun rises and sets every single day, so do the generations turn over every single day, which corresponds to "a generation goes and a generation comes." This is what we recite in the Shema. "These words that I instruct you today shall be on your hearts, and you shall teach them to your children." Deuteronomy 6:7, where "You shall teach them to your children" is adjacent to "that I instruct you today," for they are one and the same idea. That I instruct you today means specifically today, which is a warning that we must renew our efforts every single day to fulfill the Torah and the commandments. On every single day, the inclination for evil intensifies, literally anew, since on every single day, we must make brand new sortings out through the Torah and service to counter the many forces of evil that surround each and every holy act. This is because the holy sparks have fallen into the deepest depths of the realm of evil, and since on each and every day we must sort out these sparks anew, so do the forces of evil renew their efforts every single day. For this reason, the Torah warns us that I instruct you today, specifically today, as our sages said, every day they should be as new in your eyes. For certainly, the words of the Torah are literally new every day, since the words of the Torah, which correspond to the elevation of the souls, are renewed every single day. For every single day, we must accomplish brand new sortings out. Therefore, you shall teach them to your children, which means teaching them the Torah in order to transmit to them of God and the holiness of His Torah from generation to generation, in order to complete the sortings out of the sparks and the souls in every generation as appropriate, until the coming of the Messiah. That is why it is adjacent to that I instruct you today, for the two are literally one and the same, since the sorting out of the sparks and the souls must be done literally every single day anew, and similarly with every single generation anew, for every day corresponds to a new generation, as in the sun rises and the sun sets. A generation goes and a generation comes. For the ultimate sorting out of the sparks and the souls is for the sake of God's glory, for glory is the root of everything, and the world was created so that the creatures come to know Him. This knowing of God's glory and greatness is revealed every day anew, as in, the heavens tell of God's glory. Day to day they speak. Psalms 19, 2-3. This corresponds to days will speak. Job 32, 7, for every day speaks and tells of God's glory to the extent of the sorting out of the sparks on that specific day, which corresponds to the renewal of creation on that day. Section 4. This corresponds to the prohibition of slaughtering the mother and child animal on the same day. Just as human beings must be sorted out specifically from one day to the next and from one generation to the next, similarly, animals and beasts require new sortings out every day and every generation. It is all one idea, for the souls in animals are human souls that have incarnated in them, which is why God commanded them as well to multiply Genesis 1:22 in order to complete the sorting out on every day and in every generation. But the ultimate sorting out of the souls in animals is through slaughter, for specifically during slaughter does the soul leave the animal and ascend to its true status as a human being. That is why the Torah prohibited slaughtering the mother and child on the same day, for the sorting out of the animal, which is through slaughter, and the slaughter of the child are two separate sortings out, which correspond to two unique days, for the changing of days and the changing of generations are one and the same. So obviously we cannot slaughter them both on the same day, since it is impossible to sort out two generations on one day. And if one attempts to sort out two unique generations on one day, then the realm of evil will intensify even more, since one is attempting to sort out in the wrong time. Thus, since the ultimate rectification and sorting out of the animal is through slaughter, therefore one must not slaughter an animal and its child on one day, for it is impossible to sort out two separate generations on the same day, for every single day corresponds to a separate generation. Section 5. This is why a full fast must be at least one full day, as are the fasts of Yom Kippur and the fasts decreed by the sages, they are all one full day. Similarly, all the fasts that one accepts upon oneself for repentance must all be no less than 1 full day. This is because the ultimate rectification and ascension of the soul is through a fast, as explained in the lesson, and therefore the minimum fast time is 1 full day, since the rectification must take place in days in which the blemish also took place, for days correspond to the middah attributes, as in, what is the middah, measure of my days? Psalms 39:5. As the Rebbe writes elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 33. There, in the attributes, which correspond to days, take place all blemishes and rectifications, which is why every individual, to the extent of their blemishes, on account of their sins, must fast in repentance in order to rectify and sort out the blemishes of their soul for no less than 1 day, since the rectification and the sorting out take place in days. Section 6. This corresponds to the shkalim that the Israelites were instructed to give in order to atone for the sin of the golden calf, which comprises all sins, since that is when the filth returned to them. So they were instructed after Yom Kippur to give shkalim as atonement, as written, to atone for your souls. Exodus 30:15, which corresponds to the reward of a fast is charity, Brachot 6b, since the essence of a fast is charity for the land of Israel, through which we elevate the soul and subdue the body. That is why, after Yom Kippur, which is a holy fast day, we were instructed to give the shkalim, which corresponds to the benevolence of the heart, which corresponds to the reward of a fast is charity. All this in order to rectify the sin of the golden calf that comprises all sins, in order to subdue matter and body, and to rectify and elevate the soul, as in, to atone for your souls, specifically for your souls. This is because the shkalim correspond to charity for the land of Israel, which corresponds to the sinless breath of young school children, for the elevation of the soul is achieved through this. This, in turn, is because the shkalim were donated toward the construction of the sanctuary, and as known, the sanctuary was constructed in order to evoke and manifest the sanctity of the land of Israel, which is mainly in the temple, which corresponds to the sanctuary. For the sanctuary and the temple are one and the same. As our sages said, the temple is called a sanctuary eruvin, 2a. Thus, wherever the sanctuary temporarily stood, all the laws of the temple were in effect, such as regarding the prohibition of foreigners or the defiled to enter. This was because the sanctuary embodied the sanctity of the temple, which corresponds to the sanctity of the land of Israel, which corresponds to the breath of young school children who receive this holy breath from the sanctuary, specifically from the Holy of Holies, in which stood the cherubs who had childish faces, Sukkah. 5b, corresponding to young school children, for the young school children receive their breath from the sanctuary of each and every tzaddik. Thus, through the charity of the shkalim for the sanctuary, which corresponds to the sanctity of the land of Israel, which corresponds to the breath of young school children, through this we are able to subdue matter and body and to elevate the soul, which is the rectification for all sins, since all sins are caused by the filth of the body that returned on account of the sin of the golden calf. Section 7. This is why the subdual of Haman Amalek came about through the shkalim, as our sages said, wicked one. Their shkalim have already preceded yours. Megillah 13b. This is because Amalek embodies the forces of evil that intensify greatly every single day anew, and in every single generation anew, and in line with the sortings out that we must accomplish on every day and in every generation anew. So does Amalek redouble its efforts every day and in every generation anew. This is why a battle for God with Amalek from generation to generation, Exodus 17:16 specifically, from generation to generation, for in every single generation God must battle with them anew. That is why the subdual of Haman Amalek is achieved through a fast, which is why Esther decreed a fast, as written, Fast for me, Esther 4:16, and recorded the fast for posterity, as written, the fasts and the outcries. There, 9:31, to declare and make known that the subdual of Haman Amalek, who embodies the forces of evil in every generation, is achieved through a fast. Thus, also in Moses' time, the subdual was achieved through a fast, as our sages say on the verse, Moses, Aaron, and Hur ascended, Exodus 17:10. They were fasting. That is why the ultimate subdual of Haman Amalek is achieved through the shkalim, for the essence of a fast is charity, which corresponds to shkalim. Section 8. This is why the wicked Haman cast the lot from day to day and from month to month, Esther 3:7, until the lot fell on the 13th of Adar. Haman, who was wise in evil and an expert in magic, knew that the sortings out of every day are specific for each day and for each generation. So, with his evil wisdom, he cast the lot in order to ascertain the month and the day on which he would be able to overcome the Jewish people. This lot was obviously not some meaningless ritual, and he certainly ascertained very well to a very specific day, such that it would be impossible to withstand it. But God, who is mightier than all, performed great, wondrous, and amazing miracles for us, helping and supporting Mordecai and Esther through the fasts and outcries to subdue the wicked Haman and all the Amalekites, specifically on that very day, turning things on their head, Esther 9:1. And indeed, this was an amazingly incomparable miracle of overturning the lot from one extreme to the other, such that specifically on that day were the Amalekites wiped out. That is why these days are called Purim, after the Pur, lot there, 9:26. For the essence of this amazing and awesome miracle was that the lot of Haman, who was an expert magician and wise in evil, in which he had been exceedingly precise in ascertaining that specific day, was overturned. Indeed, it was a time of very great distress, and it was completely impossible to counter him on that day, which is why even the celestial hosts acquiesced to the decree. But a fool does not know how deep are the thoughts of God, and there is never any cause for despair in the world. For though indeed this was a day most propitious for Haman to carry out his evil, and it was very difficult to oppose him, such that the entire Jewish people was very nearly wiped out, nevertheless, you are exalted forever, O God, Psalms 92:9. And even if a sharp sword is hanging over one's neck, one should never refrain from seeking mercy, Brachot 10a. So through the fasting decreed by Mordecai and Esther, things were overturned from one extreme to the other, and the lot of annihilation fell upon Haman and his family specifically on that day. As known, whenever the potential power of forces of evil is very great, there is an extremely exalted holiness hidden and buried there. Only that it is so extremely concealed that it appears that it is absolutely impossible to subdue those forces of evil. But the truth is that if one truly desires, one can overcome them, but it requires very great and profuse effort, fasting and crying out, beseeching and praying for compassion, similar to what Mordecai and Esther did in their time. Then one is able to bring about a complete overturning of events as happened then, when specifically, on the day upon which the lot had fallen, they overcame Haman, and the lot of annihilation fell upon him. Which is why Purim is named specifically after the Pur, the lot. And the same is true in every generation, and on every single day, as written. These days are remembered and celebrated in every generation. Esther 9:28. Understand these ideas very well for their practical relevance, for your eternal life is dependent upon them to believe and know that every single day, at all times, and in all places, you always have the power, no matter what, to overcome. Whatever it is, you have to overcome on that specific day and that specific place. God will help you and save you. Amen. Section 9. This corresponds to the 18 types of wounded animals that are forbidden to eat, for these types of wounds are fatal. God created the human being with a body and a soul, matter and form, which correspond to human and animal, so that the human being will have free choice to overcome and subdue and break the body and the matter, which correspond to the animal, and to elevate the soul, which corresponds to the human. For this purpose was the human being created, and once the human being was created, all things were given over to his responsibility, that specifically the human being will sort everything out. That is why it is impossible to subdue the spirit of animality of the animal that descends below to the earth. Ecclesiastes 3:21 other than by the human being. For, specifically, the human being possesses the power to sort out the spirit of animality and to elevate it from animal to human. That is why, if the animal dies naturally on its own, it is considered a carcass and is forbidden to eat, and even if it is mortally wounded, it is considered as dead and cannot be eaten. For God has given everything into our hands, we who possess free choice, that specifically we must extract the soul from the animal through ritual slaughter. Specifically then, when the slaughterer has properly fulfilled the commandment of slaughter, specifically then is the soul of the animal sorted out and elevated from animal to human, from living creature to speaking creature. Only the human being possesses this power, since for this very reason he was created to wage this battle to subdue the body, which corresponds to animal. This corresponds to the slaughter knife, which corresponds to a fast. This is because the ultimate subdual of the body, which corresponds to animal, is through a fast, through which we elevate from animal to human. And the essential definition of a human being is the ability to speak. The human being can speak, and an animal cannot speak, as in, they are silent like animals. Psalms 49:13. And through a fast one leaves the category of animal and becomes a human being, meaning that one attains speech, which is the definition of a human being. This corresponds to the slaughter knife, as in the praises of God in their throat and a multi-bladed sword in their hand. There, 149:6 for the Shechitah, which corresponds to speech, as in, O God, open my lips there, 51:17 corresponds to God's sword, as mentioned in the lesson, which corresponds to the slaughter knife. Hence, the slaughter knife, which corresponds to God's sword, corresponds to speech, which corresponds to a fast, through which we attain speech, leaving the category of animal and becoming a human being, which is speech. For the body and matter correspond to animal, over which are empowered the forces of evil, which correspond to Amalek, to Esau, who was the filth of the serpent, and who is in charge of the sword, as in, You shall live by your sword, Genesis 27:40, and their subdual is through a fast, which is more painful than a sword. Sefer Hamidot, Repentance, number 83. This is because the essence of a fast is charity, specifically charity for the land of Israel, which corresponds to sinless breath, the breath of young school children. For every individual must attain the ability to overcome and break matter and body through fasting to the extent that one attains sinless breath, just as young school children. Section 10. This is because the subdual of Esau Amalek is through the sound of young school children, as our sages said on the verse. The voice is the voice of Jacob, and the hands are the hands of Esau. Genesis 27:22. When the voice is the voice of Jacob, which is when school children chatter with their voices, then the hands are not the hands of Esau. Genesis Rabbah 65:20. From this, the slaughterer must receive the sword of slaughter, as explained in the lesson, that he must possess sinless breath as young school children. For through a fast, through which one attains the sinless breath of young school children, one attains the power to overcome Amalek, specifically with a sword, as in, Joshua weakened Amalek and their people by the sword. Exodus 17:13, specifically by the sword. 4. The handle of the axe to cut down the forest comes from the forest, Sanhedrin 39b, for his entire power is the sword. That is why through a fast, through which we subdue him, we thereby take the sword specifically from him and subdue him specifically by that very sword. Indeed, at the time of that battle with Amalek, they were fasting, as our sages said on the verse, Moses, Aaron, and Hur, Exodus 17:10. And similarly, in the times of Mordecai, a fast was decreed, as written, the fasts, Esther 9:31. For a fast is more painful than a sword, since through a fast we overcome the body to which Amalek is attached, and take the sword from him and subdue him specifically by the sword, as happened in the times of Mordecai, when they slaughtered Haman and the Amalekites by the sword. All this through the power of a fast, as in, fast for me, as said. This corresponds to the slaughter knife, the root of which is the subdual of matter and body, which correspond to animal by a fast. From there we receive the power of the slaughter knife, to subdue with it the animal and elevate the soul from living creature to speaking creature. Section 11. With the above, you will now see something amazing. Our sages derive the necessity to check the slaughter knife from the verse, "You shall slaughter it with this." 1 Samuel 14:24. Chulin 17b. For this verse was said by Saul after having fasted on that day. 1 Samuel 14:24-34, since the ultimate rectification of slaughter comes through a fast, as said. Section 12. Regarding the prohibition of a carcass or a mortally wounded animal that is also considered as already having died, the ultimate rectification of slaughter is to subdue the spirit of animality, which corresponds to the body, to death, and therefore an animal that has died without ritual slaughter is forbidden, for the realm of death has overcome it, when the spirit of animality intensifies. A Jewish person must not eat of an animal without ritual slaughter, which corresponds to a fast, for through this we subdue the spirit of animality, which corresponds to death, to the body, and we elevate the soul from living creature to speaking creature, from animal to human. This is because it is impossible to subdue and eliminate the realm of death from an animal other than specifically through a free-willed human being, for a human being has free choice, and is therefore able to dispel the realm of death from himself by sanctifying his body and subduing the body and matter, which correspond to death in comparison to the soul, which corresponds to life, which is why the Torah and the commandments are called life, as written, "He shall live by them," Leviticus 18:5. Also, the righteous are called alive, even in death brachot 18a, for they have dispelled the realm of death from themselves. But an animal has no free choice, so only a human being who has free choice is able to rectify it, so that the realm of death is eliminated from it, so that it can be eaten by a Jewish person. Section 13. This corresponds to the 4 Torah sections that we read during the month of Adar around Purim and Pesach time. Purim and Pesach are the totality of all redemptions. Pesach is a commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt, which comprises all exiles, for all exiles are called after Egypt. And the miracle of Purim was even greater, for it was the downfall of Haman Amalek, who was the first of nations, Numbers 24:20. Now the essence of the subdual of Egypt and Amalek, who are the totality of the realm of evil, is to subdue and eliminate the filth of the serpent that is attached to the body, which corresponds to animal, from where the realm of evil, which corresponds to Amalek and Egypt, draws its power. Hence, there are 4 kingdoms comprised within Amalek, who is the first of nations, as the Rebbe writes elsewhere, Likutey Moharan, Part 1. 30. For their power comes from the body, that is, from the evil of the 4 fundamental elements. That is why we read the 4 Torah sections before Pesach and Purim, in order to subdue and dispel the 4 evil kingdoms, to subdue and eliminate the evil of the 4 fundamental elements in the body through the sanctity of a cover, fast. Thus, the first of the 4 sections is that of shkalim, when the people donated toward the sanctuary, which is charity, which corresponds to a fast, as in, the reward of a fast is charity, brachot, 6b, and why all the sacrificial offerings, which correspond to the subdual of the spirit of animality, were brought in the sanctuary, through which are rectified all sins that are caused by animality, which corresponds to the body, to darkness, to death. For everything is subdued and dispelled through the sanctuary that came about through Jewish donations, which corresponds to charity that were given after the fast of Yom Kippur, corresponding to the reward of a fast is charity. Through this, the body, corresponding to animal, to death, is subdued, which is why the verse says regarding the shkalim, so that there will be no plague upon them. Exodus 30:12. For the realm of death, which corresponds to the body, has been eliminated. After this, we read the section of remembering Amalek, to annihilate Amalek. For Amalek is the very filth of the serpent, the realm of death, corresponding to the body, to animal, which is why the Amalekites disguised themselves as animals. Rashi, 1 Samuel 15:3. So we must subdue them through the shkalim, which correspond to charity, to a fast, as our sages said. Their shkalim have already preceded yours, Haman's Megillah, 13b. That is why a fast was decreed in the times of Mordecai and Esther, and in the times of Moses they were also fasting during the battle with Amalek, for their ultimate subdual is achieved through a fast. Hence, remember what Amalek did to you. Deuteronomy 25:17, specifically remember, to intensify memory over forgetfulness. For memory and forgetfulness correspond to soul and body, to life and death, to human and animal, to light and darkness. Then we read the section of the red heifer, which purifies from the defilement of death in order to subdue the realm of death, which corresponds to the body, to animal. After that, we read the section of the new moon, which is the commandment to sanctify the month, to intercalate the year, so that the solar year and the lunar year are maintained parallel, which corresponds to the filling of the blemish of the moon, when darkness will be dispelled, since the darkness of night is on account of the blemishing of the moon. But in the future, when the blemish of the moon will be filled, darkness will be dispelled, as written, your sun will no longer set, and your moon will no longer be gathered, in Isaiah 60:20. Hence, through the section of the new moon, which corresponds to the commandment of sanctifying the month, we subdue and dispel darkness, which corresponds to the body, to animal. Thus, all of the 4 sections are to subdue the evil of the 4 fundamental elements, which correspond to death, darkness, animal, body, forgetfulness, and intensify the soul, which corresponds to human, to light, to life. All this is achieved through a fast, which corresponds to charity, which corresponds to the shkalim donated toward the sanctuary after Yom Kippur, from which the miracle of Purim, the power to subdue Haman Amalek, arose, which is why we begin by reading the section of the shkalim. This is the meaning of the statement in the Holy Zohar that Purim corresponds to Yom Kippur Tikkuni, Zohar 21:57b, for the miracle of Purim of subduing Amalek, who is the filth and lusts of the body, is through a fast, which corresponds to the fast of Yom Kippur. For the holiness of all fast days comes from the fast of Yom Kippur, since the ultimate subdual of the 4 fundamental elements of the body and their elevation from animal to human is through a fast. Section 14. This is why the entire sanctity of the sanctuary and the temple corresponds to the fast of Yom Kippur. This is because only on the day of this holy fast, the day of the fast of Yom Kippur, did the high priest enter into the Holy of Holies, which is the highest of the 10 levels of holiness, from which all other levels arise. For there, between the poles of the ark, was the ultimate dwelling of the divine presence, which is the root of all holiness. As written, I am God who sanctifies you. Exodus 31:13. The ultimate purpose of all holiness in the sanctuary and in the temple was to subdue and dispel the filth of the serpent, which corresponds to animal, to body, and so forth. For the ultimate reason for which the sanctuary and the temple were built was to bring up in them all of the sacrificial offerings, which are from animals and birds, in order to subdue the spirit of animality, which corresponds to the body, and so forth, through which all sins that are atoned by it are atoned, the sins of every individual, the sin of Adam, and the sin of the golden calf, for which the sanctuary and the temple atone. All of these were caused by the filth of the serpent that is attached to the body, to the animal, to death, and so forth. That is why the entire power of the sanctuary and the temple to rectify and atone for all this comes from the Holy of Holies, into which no one ever entered beside the high priest on the fast day of Yom Kippur. This is because this holiness to subdue the body, the animal, and so forth is impossible to evoke other than through a fast, which corresponds to sinless breath, the breath of young school children. For these children receive their breath from the sanctuary and the temple. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 282. And this mainly from the holies of holies, from between the poles of the ark. For the cherubs that stood there had childish faces. Sukkah 5b, corresponding to the young school children. For the young school children receive their breath from the sanctuary of each and every tzaddik. Thus, through the charity of the shkalim for the sanctuary, which corresponds to the sanctity of the land of Israel, which corresponds to the breath of young school children, through this we are able to subdue matter and body, corresponding to animal and so forth, and ameliorate all judgments, atone for all sins, through which is elevated the soul, which corresponds to Torah. Amen and Amen. Section 15. This corresponds to the priestly gifts given to the priests from slaughtered animals. Yoreh De'ah 61. These gifts given to the priest correspond to charity for the land of Israel, which corresponds to a fast, through which we subdue matter and body, corresponding to animal, and elevate the soul, which corresponds to human. The priest corresponds to the holiness of the land of Israel, for the service of the priest is in the temple, related to the sacrificial offerings, which is the ultimate root of the holiness of the land of Israel. And thus, the gifts that the Jewish people gave to the priests to support them so that they could perform their service in the temple corresponds to charity for the land of Israel, whose holiness derives from the temple, which corresponds to the holiness of the priest. That is why we must give the priestly gifts which correspond to charity for the land of Israel from a slaughtered animal. For charity for the land of Israel corresponds to a fast through which the soul is elevated from animal to human. So we give the forearm, the jaws, and the stomach, and our sages say that the forearm corresponds to the hand, as in Pinchas took a spear in his hand, Numbers 25. 7. The jaws correspond to Pinchas's prayer, and the stomach corresponds to Pinchas stabbed the woman in her stomach, Chulin 134b. So hence, all of these priestly gifts are in Pinchas's merit for his avenging Zimri's act. Pinchas indeed avenged God's vengeance against the wicked Bilam, since Zimri's act with the Moabite women happened on account of Bilam's advice there. 31:16. And Bilam corresponds to Amalek, and the main letters of their names are identical. Bilam, Amalek. Bilam and Amalek are both the very essence of the filth of the serpent, which is the lust of the body and matter, the lust of the inclination for evil, which is expressed mainly in sexual lust. As stated in the Holy Zohar and cited by the Rebbe Likutey Moharan, Part 2, end. So, the main battle between the soul and the body is regarding this lust, for the Holy Covenant is the channel through which all souls come into the world, since through it, procreation takes place. Thus, Whoever sanctifies their sexual relations properly will bring about a holy birth, such that the soul will reign over the body, and whoever does not, then the opposite will come about, which is why this is the site of the greatest battle. So Pinchas, who became zealous in response to Zimri's act and subdued the sexual lust, which corresponds to the filth of Bilam Amalek, avenging the vengeance of the covenant and subduing matter and body, which correspond to animal, and enhancing and elevating the soul, which corresponds to human, since the soul is elevated mainly through the sanctity of the covenant, therefore attained that he, his brethren priests and his sons, would be given the forearm, jaws, and stomachs of slaughtered animals, as said. This is because Pinchas's entire zealousness to subdue the filth of matter corresponding to animal, which is why whoever slaughters an animal corresponding to matter, and to elevate the soul from living creature to human speaker, must therefore give the priestly gifts the forearm, the jaws, and the stomach in correspondence to Pinchas's act, in order to evoke the holiness of Pinchas, who had achieved the subdual of the filth of matter, which is the filth of Bilam Amalek, and the elevation of the soul, which is the ultimate rectification of the animal that must be achieved by its slaughterers. This is why we must give the gifts of the forearm, the jaws, and the stomach, specifically in correspondence to Pinchas's act. Section 16. And the forearm, jaws, and stomach, which correspond to charity for the land of Israel, correspond themselves to a fast, through which the soul is elevated from living creature to human speaker. For this soul in the living creature is literally the reincarnated soul of a human being who had possessed the capacity to speak, but on account of whose sins had descended from human to animal. That is why we must give the forearm and jaws to the priest, for they are the means with which a human being speaks. The 5 origins of speech in the mouth are affixed in the jaws, which is why our sages said that, together with the jaws, we must give to the priest the animal's tongue, chulin, 134b, which is situated between the jaws, since the ultimate purpose is to rectify the tongue and speech, to elevate the soul that has fallen into animality, into an inability to speak, to elevate it back into human being who is able to speak. And the forearm corresponds to the root of speech, for the root of speech comes from the 5 fingers of the left forearm, Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 38. And this, although we give specifically the right forearm to the priest, for as known, the lower level is always considered as the left of the higher level, and all the more so an animal compared to a human being. For the entire category of animal, even its right side, is very distant from even the left side of a human being. And if only we would be able to elevate the animal's right forearm to the human being's left forearm, which is the root of speech, as said. As for the stomach, this is the main organ of digestion of eaten food, so we give the animal's stomach to the priest, which corresponds to a fast, which corresponds to charity. For the ultimate purpose of a fast is to subdue and break the lust for eating, upon which human life is dependent. For all souls are dependent upon eating, as we declare in the blessing, "For everything you created, to therewith sustain the life of every living soul." Thus, eating is the main site of sorting out between animal and human. Thus, when we seek to subdue the body and elevate the soul from animal to human, we must fast to break the lust for eating, which is the vitality of the soul, to break its material lusts, so that one is able to thereby elevate the soul, which is the animal's vitality, to human being. So the ultimate purpose of a fast is charity, as in, the reward of a fast is charity. For indeed, human eating is very precious. That is, when one eats with the holiness of a Jewish person who is called a human being, then one's eating is certainly very precious, for specifically through such eating is the soul elevated, as in, a tzaddik eats to his soul's satiation, Proverbs 13:5. And then one is able to elevate the soul, corresponding to the human being, specifically through one's eating, and to subdue the body, corresponding to the animal. But if one is still unable to do this, and one's eating is not in the category of human eating, then the body and matter are in their potency, and then one must fast. And the ultimate purpose of this fast is charity, meaning that one must fast to break the lust for eating, the lust of the body, and through the charity that one gives to a deserving pauper, especially if it is charity for the land of Israel, one sustains the soul of the paupers of the land of Israel, through which the soul is elevated by means of one's having given a portion of one's food that one would have otherwise eaten on the fast day. One gives this to the pauper to sustain his soul, as brought in the literature as the proper thing to do. Hence, the ultimate purpose of a fast is to subdue the lust for eating and to give this portion of one's food to a deserving pauper, through which one subdues matter and elevates the soul from living creature to speaking creature, from animal to human. This corresponds to giving to the priest the animal's stomach, which is the main organ of eating, and by giving the stomach, which is the main organ of eating, to the priest, which corresponds to charity for the land of Israel. One thereby evokes the sanctity of a fast, which is literally the same idea, which is to subdue animal food, which is the lust for eating, and elevating the eating into holiness through the charity for the land of Israel, which corresponds to the elevation of the soul. Related to earlier. Section 17. This is why Haman presented a tree 50 cubits high, Esther 5:14. He sought to overcome the holiness of Yom Kippur, which is a fast day and is the mystery of the Great Jubilee, which is 50 years, the ultimate sanctity of which is on Yom Kippur, which is the mystery of the world of the future, when a great shofar will be blown. Isaiah 27:13, all of which corresponds to repentance, to a fast, through which we subdue matter, and so forth. Haman sought to overcome all of this, so he cast a lot, Esther 3:7, in order to overcome the lot of Yom Kippur, regarding which is written, Aaron shall place on the 2 goats lots, 1 lot for God. Leviticus 16:8. But God, in his compassion, gave the Jewish people the power to overcome him through the power of the holiness of fasts that they fasted, as written, the fasts and the outcries, Esther 9:31. For through a fast we subdue matter, which corresponds to the filth of Haman Amalek, and we elevate the soul. That is why Haman was hanged specifically on a 50-cubit high tree, for his downfall was specifically from there, through the people's having fasted to the extent that they evoked through their fasting the sanctity of Yom Kippur, which corresponds to the Jubilee, as in the 50th year, Leviticus 25:11, through which he and his descendants were hanged specifically on that tree. Thus, Haman's poor lot became our poor lot, which is why these days were called specifically Purim, after the poor lot, for the lot that he cast came back upon himself, since through the fasts the people evoked the sanctity of Yom Kippur, the sanctity of the lot of Yom Kippur, for their downfall came about mainly through the fast. This is the meaning of the Holy Zohar that states that Purim corresponds to Yom Kippur Tikkuni, Zohar 21:57b. Law 5. The laws of ritual slaughter will be explained here based on the lesson in Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 61, mentioned in the laws of the 9th of Av and fast days. Study there the entire lesson well. Section 1. This corresponds to ritual slaughter, for the essence of this commandment is for the purpose of rectifying the soul that is in the living creature and elevating it from creature to human being, who corresponds to intelligence. This is because the sparks and souls that exist in beasts, animals, and birds are reincarnations of human beings that have fallen on account of their sins from the category of human being, who corresponds to intelligence, to the category of creature, which corresponds to a lack of intelligence. And the main cause of this fall is the blemish in faith in the sages, on account of which intelligence is blemished. For on account of this blemish, putrid vapors rise to the mind, distorting and confusing one's intelligence. And when intelligence is blemished, one falls from human to animal, which is a lack of intelligence, a confused strategy, as in, man will not remain in glory, he has become like animals. Silent. Psalms 49:13. Glory refers to tefillin, as our sages said Megillah 16b. For the tefillin correspond to the mind, to clear and pure mind, as in, tefillin require a clean body, Shabbat 49 say. And whoever blemishes in this, in man will not remain in glory, then he has become like animals. Silent, meaning that he falls into the category of animal, which is a lack of intelligence. Section 2. That is why the rectification is achieved through ritual slaughter. For the knife and sword of slaughter corresponds to a dispute, which is called a sword, as written, "The wicked have opened a sword," Psalms 37:14, which Rashi there explains to mean a dispute. This is because the rectification of faith in the sages is achieved through dispute. For through dispute we repent over the blemish of faith in the sages, which is the cause of the dispute. This leads to the composition of a book, through which the Torah is made more complete, through which all judgments in the world are ameliorated, all of which corresponds to the rectification of faith in the sages, which is the rectification of intelligence, the rectification of strategy. This is why the punishment and rectification of a soul that has reincarnated in an animal, because it did not repent while still alive, such that it was forced to return in an animal, is to bear the pain of slaughter by the slaughter knife and sword that comes from dispute, as said. That is why the slaughter knife must be completely free of the slightest blemish. Yoreh De'ah 18:2. For God seeks the rectification of the soul, since all punishments are actually rectifications, so the knife must be without the slightest blemish. For the ultimate rectification and wholeness of the slaughter knife is attained through the wholeness of the Torah, that is achieved through the proliferation of books that are composed as a result of dispute from dispute, which is caused by a blemish in faith in the sages, is evoked the rectification of the slaughter knife and sword, and by the slaughterer's toiling to rectify the knife so that it will be whole without the slightest blemish. Through that, he rectifies the blemish of dispute and evokes the wholeness from the books of Torah that were composed by the repentance over the dispute, which represent the wholeness of the Torah. Then, the sword and knife of slaughter corresponds to the wholeness of the Torah, through which more books are composed, which makes the Torah even more complete, as in, "Gird your sword on your waist," Psalms 45:4, which refers to Torah scholars arguing in Torah Shabbat. 63a, as in, "Each one with his sword on his waist," Song of Songs 3:8, as Rashi explains there. Through this is the soul rectified and elevated from animal to human, which is intelligence, as in, God's Torah is whole, restoring the soul. Psalms 19:8, God's Torah is whole, means that the Torah is whole and complete through the proliferation of holy books that have been composed through the repentance done over dispute, through which faith in the sages is rectified, through which the knife and sword of slaughter is made whole. Through this, restoring the soul, for this restores the soul from animal to human, from the blemish of intelligence and strategy to the rectification of intelligence and the wholeness of strategy. That is why the slaughterer must receive the knife from a Torah scholar, as our sages said, Chulin 17b, for by showing his knife to a Torah scholar, the wholeness of the knife is verified and made whole, since the wholeness of the knife comes specifically through a Torah scholar, which is through the rectification of faith in the sages. That is why the sages were so stringent in this, and said, any slaughterer who does not show his knife to a Torah scholar is to be excommunicated there. 18a. For the ultimate rectification of slaughter is attained through the authentic sages, that is, through faith in the sages. Section 3. The main rectification and wholeness of the slaughter knife without blemish is dependent upon the blade of the knife, which cuts the animal's vital organs. This corresponds to the completion of strategy, so that is it truly as it should be, which corresponds to the cutting of the law, which corresponds to halachic ruling. As we find our sages referring to this as cutting the laws, this is because the laws are the strategies, for the entire Torah corresponds to strategies. And the ruling of the law of a Torah commandment corresponds to the completion of the strategy, for the ultimate rectification of the strategy is at its end and completion, when one is able through the strategy to attain eternal success. For there are many strategies that seem at the time to be good strategies, but in the end, they do not bring success, so they are obviously not good strategies at all. And to attain complete strategies, to thereby attain eternal success, one needs very many salvations. One must beg of God for this very profusely, every single day, as we indeed pray frequently. Establish us in good strategy before you, and save us quickly for the sake of your name. And as the Rebbe said, we should beg and plead of God for this very profusely. Sichot Haran, number 238. The pinnacle of strategy being at its end corresponds to the end of something is better than its beginning. Ecclesiastes 7:8. And even on the physical plane, we can understand why this is so. Sometimes there are many reasons to do something, and they seem to be sound arguments, but nevertheless, one counter-argument arises and refutes them all to show that one must do exactly the opposite. But we cannot go into detail to explain all this. However, every individual can understand from their own life, from what happens with the plans and strategies that one lays out for oneself. Even when one does succeed one time with one's business strategy, who knows if this strategy will succeed the next time? We have seen many who succeeded by purchasing a certain merchandise, but then, relying on the same strategy, borrow money and purchase a huge amount way beyond their means of that same merchandise, only for the market price to fall precipitously, leaving them debtors. Many have had to flee on account of such events. So the truth is that it is very difficult for a person to ascertain the correct strategy for oneself, and one must rely only on God and beg Him profusely to show them the proper strategy. And the most important thing is that one attain eternal success. For even if one succeeds in business one's entire life, if one has not attained wealth for the eternal life, what benefit does one have from all of one's toil? As the verse says about this, wealth kept for its owner to their detriment. Ecclesiastes 8:12. Therefore, the ultimate rectification of strategy is at the end. This corresponds to the wholeness of the slaughter knife, whose wholeness is at its end, the tip of its blade, the part that cuts the flesh, which is the cutting of the law, which corresponds to the full completion of strategy that comes from the wholeness of the Torah that is attained through books, from which comes the wholeness of the knife, as said earlier. Section 4. This corresponds to the 12 things that are checked in the slaughter knife, corresponding to Jacob's 12 stones that merged into one, which is attained through the rectification of faith in the sages, that is attained through the proliferation of books, that is achieved through the rectification of dispute, from which comes the wholeness without blemish of the slaughter knife. This corresponds to the laws of a blemish of a slaughter knife being the same as the laws regarding a blemish in the altar. On the altar were brought sacrificial offerings, which are to ameliorate judgments, and the ultimate amelioration is evoked from the Holy of Holies, the foundation stone, the stone tablets that stood in the temple. All ascensions of all prayers and offerings must go through there, so the altar must be whole without blemish, so that it will be whole through the wholeness of the Torah. From there too comes the wholeness of the slaughter knife, so the measure of a blemish in the slaughter knife is the same as a blemish in the altar, for they are one and the same. Section 5. This corresponds to the prohibition of concealing the knife during slaughter, Yoreh De'ah 24/7, that nothing should cover the slaughter knife. This law is called Chalada, from the word chulda, a rat, as Rashi explains there, for a rat hides in holes. This is because the ultimate purpose of the slaughter is to elevate the soul from living creature to speaking creature, and the essence of elevating the soul is to extract it and elevate it from hiddenness into manifestation. For as a rule, the lower the level, the more that godliness is constricted and concealed at that level. God indeed is everywhere. As written, "You sustain all," Nehemiah 9:6. But the lower the level, the more that this is hidden and concealed. The entire service of a human being is to elevate and bring godliness into the world, from hiddenness into manifestation, such that every creature will know that you have created them. Rosh Hashanah prayers. But great effort and toil is required to manifest from hiddenness, for this is the entire service of the human being in this world. And due to the great hiddenness, not everyone is able to achieve this and to manifest from hiddenness other than the great authentic tzaddikim and sages who, with their extreme wisdom, evoke very amazing intelligence through which they uncover the hiddenness and make godliness known in the world, revealing the truth that the entire world is emptiness, a passing shadow, a dispersing vapor. They offer strategies and upright paths for each individual appropriate to their level, in a way that each one is able to rescue their soul from the delusion of the world that is caused by the great hiddenness, and that one devotes all of one's efforts toward one's ultimate end, to be spared from the depths of hell and to attain eternal life by recognizing God, which is the ultimate purpose. And though everybody knows that this world is empty and meaningless, nevertheless, the hiddenness is so great that everyone pursues it and no one gives a thought for eternity. As written, "This is their way, foolishness is theirs, though they speak about their ends endlessly." Psalms 49:14. For even if they do occasionally remember and declare what will happen in the end, they have no idea of a strategy how to rescue their souls. Thus, the most important thing is faith in the authentic sages, for in their great wisdom, they know how to uncover this hiddenness and to give amazing strategies to each individual appropriate to their level. This is why when David began speaking of the great emptiness of the world, he began this psalm with, "My mouth will speak wisdom, the thought of my heart understanding. I will lean my ear to parable." After which, he speaks of the great foolishness and emptiness of this world, as written there, "Those who rely on their wealth, they will leave their wealth behind to others. This is their way, foolishness is theirs." However, it seems strange what is the great wisdom and understanding that David reveals in this psalm, crying out that the world is empty and meaningless, and that one will take nothing with them upon death who is not aware of all this. Even gross and ignorant people know this and declare openly that one takes nothing of their wealth with them to the grave, and that this world is a passing shadow. So why did David preface his words with, "My mouth will speak wisdom," as if he is revealing here some great wisdom and understanding? However, the truth is that though everybody knows this, nevertheless, it is great wisdom and understanding to talk about it frequently and to cry out and declare this hiddenness. And we find that all of the great authentic sages cried out profusely about this. The entire book of Ecclesiastes is filled with it. And similarly, King David speaks of it in several of the Psalms, and we find it through the Holy Literature. This is because the authentic tzaddikim speak of this with such deep wisdom that they are able to constantly arouse people from their sleep and error, and truly remember the awesome foolishness of this world and return to God. That is the greatest of all wisdom, to look toward the ultimate end, as we have explained many times, that the ultimate wisdom is when, through one's wisdom, one attains eternal success. That is why David prefaces his words with, "My mouth will speak wisdom, for indeed, this is the ultimate wisdom, revealing the foolishness and emptiness of this world. For by revealing it, with the Holy Spirit. It will have the effect of bringing the truth into the world and revealing how great is the hiddenness. Section 6. This explains why this psalm opens with, "Listen, all dwellers of Kald, earth," upon which our sages comment, the earth is called Kald after the chulda, rat. For the rat is the only land species that has no parallel in water. Chulin 127a. This is very strange. Why should all dwellers on earth be called after the chulda just because it is the only species that has no parallel in water? Furthermore, why specifically in this psalm that speaks of the great emptiness of this world are the dwellers on earth called after the rat? However, the main reason why the dwellers on earth are called after the rat is because of the great hiddenness that exists in this world. For the rat dwells mainly in the foundations of houses and enters them stealthily, hiding, waiting for a moment to jump upon some food to steal. This is the essence of all mundane affairs of this world that is filled with emptiness. As written, there are many things that increase emptiness. Ecclesiastes 6:11. And all the great errors that people err in the foolishness of this world is all on account of the great hiddenness, as written, also ha'olam, literally, the world. He gave into their hearts there, 3:11, which alludes to hialim, hiddenness. Rashi, as our sages said, several things are hidden from the world. The day of death, the day of consolation, what another person is thinking, and how one will earn a livelihood. Pesakim 54b. They explain there that the day of death is hidden so that the world will endure. For if one would know the day of one's death, one would not build a house, and so forth. But so what if people will not build houses? King David himself has already criticized the builders of houses, as written, their thoughts are to build their houses forever, and who build ruins for themselves. Job 3:14 and many other verses. However, the truth is that it is all for the purpose of free choice. The entire world was only created for the purpose of free choice. And choice can only exist because there is such a great hiddenness in the world. For if everybody would see the truth with their own eyes, that the entire world is filled with godliness, as written, the entire earth is filled with His glory, Isaiah 6:3, and do I not fill the heavens and the earth? Jeremiah 23:24. And that the human being has come into this world only for the purpose of reflecting upon his ultimate end and binding himself to God specifically while in this world, through which one attains whatever one attains, then there would certainly be no free choice at all, for everyone would utterly surrender to God, and there would be no place at all for reward and punishment. The world as we know it could not possibly exist, for this world is created and is sustained only for the purpose of reward and punishment, which is completely dependent upon free choice, and this free choice is dependent upon the hiddenness, for by the truth being hidden so greatly from the world, free choice becomes possible, and there is place for reward and punishment. But certainly, the good is overriding, and a person certainly has the power to choose the good and to look toward the truth if he so desires. But yet, this is a great battle, for this is the entire service of a human being in this world. Therefore, the most important thing is faith in the authentic sages, coming close to them, to their disciples, and to all of their followers, and to their authentic tzaddikim and sages, who have not allowed themselves to err in the foolishness of this world and have been able to be victorious in this battle, and to distance themselves completely from the emptiness and lusts of this world. They know very well all about this hiddenness in the world, and are able to evoke a very sublime intelligence that will reveal this hiddenness and manifest the truth to the world, shining amazing strategies into the heart of every individual, so that each one is able to rescue their soul from hell, so that they will not pursue the emptiness of this world, but that all of their efforts will be to attain a good end for eternal life. This is because when one attains faith in the sages, the holy books of the Torah are proliferated, through which the Torah merges into the foundation stone, into the Holy of Holies, which is the all-encompassing supernal intelligence, from where comes amelioration of all judgments in the world, through which comes complete strategy, as can be understood from the lesson. For all hiddenness and concealments of the truth are caused by the constrictions, and when we evoke the intelligence and ameliorate the judgments, to that extent do we reveal the hiddenness. But this is accomplished mainly by the great authentic tzaddik, who has attained such novel Torah insights upon which many holy books are composed, through which the Torah is made complete with amazing wholeness, through which it is possible to evoke the supernal intelligence from the Holy of Holies, from where all judgments in the world are ameliorated, through which we are able to reveal all types of hiddenness and concealments in the world, for it is all one. Section 7. For a very sublime, exalted, and deep intelligence is needed to reveal the great hiddenness in the world on account of the forces of evil having diffused so greatly and concealed the truth from the world. This intelligence corresponds to the foundation stone, to the Holy of Holies, and corresponds to the entire construction of the sanctuary and the temple, all of which was for the purpose of revealing the hiddenness and manifesting godliness. That is why we were instructed to construct the sanctuary right after the sin of the golden calf. For this sin was a blemish in faith in the sages on account of the mixed multitude having become jealous of Moses, Aaron, killing her and threatening to kill Aaron as well, then misleading the Israelites to idolatry. When Moses saw this great hiddenness that conceals the truth, that the forces of evil have the power to cause such that even after the exodus from Egypt, the splitting of the Red Sea, and the Torah giving, with such great signs and awesome miracles, nevertheless, the wicked and opposers are still able to overpower and conceal the truth to such an extent, he prayed to God profusely, until God instructed to construct the sanctuary, the main sanctity of which comes through the stone tablets, from the Holy of Holies. In other words, Moses was able to evoke an amelioration from the Holy of Holies to ameliorate all harsh judgments in the world, through which he made manifest what had been hidden and revealed godliness in the world, evoking amazing strategies for every individual. Section 8. This is why Moses spoke first about the construction of the ark, whereas Bezalel began construction with the sanctuary, arguing that where would he place the vessels if there was not first a sanctuary brachot? 55a. Moses, though, who was the tzaddik of the generation, has to evoke the amelioration from the Holy of Holies, from the ark, for it is impossible to ameliorate such judgments and to reveal such hiddenness and concealment other than through the supernal all-encompassing intelligence which corresponds to the Holy of Holies, to the stone tablets that lay in the ark that stood in the Holy of Holies. From there he evoked intelligence to all those who followed him and revealed the hiddenness. But when the followers receive this intelligence and must reveal it in the world, they must first construct many houses and rooms, as well as countless vessels in which to contain this intelligence in the world. That is why when Bezalel, who represents Moses' disciple, worked on the construction of the sanctuary, he had to first construct the sanctuary before the vessels, for he had to work himself up from the bottom to first clothe the intelligence in the sanctuary and then to construct the ark, which corresponds to the all-encompassing intelligence that shines in the Holy of Holies. For it is impossible to bring this intelligence into the world other than through many prior fundamental understandings which correspond to the construction of the sanctuary. For the entire structure on the sanctuary and the temple, with all their rooms and vessels, corresponds to intelligence upon intelligence, intelligence within intelligence, up to the Holy of Holies, in which are the stone tablets, from where the tzaddik evokes amelioration and reveals the hiddenness. But it is impossible to shine this intelligence into the world without many prior understandings, as said, which corresponds to first constructing the sanctuary and only then the ark, in which are the stone tablets. Section 9. Thus, when David sought to reveal the great hiddenness of the world and to declare the truth that everything is empty and meaningless besides coming close to God, he called out to the world as, "Dwellers of Chaled, after the chulda, rat the hiddenness of the rat that dwells in holes and hides in lurking," which corresponds to the thick klipa, shell, that hides and conceals the truth from the world, which corresponds to the koled, the first of the 8 non-kosher creeping creatures, Leviticus 11:29. That is why all earthly dwellers are called dwellers of Khaled, after the chulda, rat, since the very existence of the world as we know it is dependent upon the hiddenness, which corresponds to chulda, which makes free choice possible for which purpose the world was created. But the tzaddikim are solely involved in revealing this hiddenness and subduing the shell of the chulda, which is why this psalm calls everyone specifically dwellers of Chald. Since this psalm is coming to reveal the hiddenness and to proclaim the great emptiness of this world, as stated there, with his death he will not take anything. And in many other places the world is mentioned in the context of being a passing shadow, as in, "Remember me, that I am Chald, earthy. What man will live and never see death?" Psalms 89:48-49, and "My Keled, earthiness, is as nothing before." There, 39:6. Section 10. This is what our sages said. What is the meaning of the verse? He restores the foundation of the house. The congregation of Israel, the divine presence, is saying to God, "Your children have made me like this rat that dwells in the foundations of houses," Pesakim 118b. This teaching seems perplexing, but based upon what we have said, it can be explained as follows, quote, "The foundations of houses is to reveal the hiddenness, to dissolve the shell of the rat." So, when the Jewish people sin, as Rashi explains there, then the congregation of Israel says to God, "Your children have made me like this rat that dwells in the foundations of houses, that is, lurking in hiddenness," meaning that their sins have caused the destruction of the temple and the intensification of the hiddenness, which corresponds to a rat. Yet within the hiddenness and concealment itself is hidden the divine presence. So the congregation of Israel says, "Your children have made me like this rat," for the divine presence itself is hidden on account of the great hiddenness, as in, "I will doubly conceal," Deuteronomy 31:18. So the verse is declaring, He restores the foundation of the house, that in the future the temple will be rebuilt and the divine presence will be revealed from hiddenness, such that what was previously dwelling in the foundation of houses, like a rat, will then be restored and dwell in peace, and divine kingship and dominion will be revealed for all to see. Section 11. This is why chelada, concealing the slaughter knife, is prohibited in ritual slaughter. Since the essence of slaughter is to elevate from living creature to speaking creature, which corresponds to revealing the hiddenness, which corresponds to subduing the chulda, rat, which is the cause of all concealment. Therefore, it is obviously forbidden to conceal the knife during the slaughter, for the ultimate rectification of the slaughter is attained through the Torah scholar, who evokes the wholeness of the knife, which is attained through the books of the Torah, through which is evoked amelioration from the Holy of Holies, all of which counters the chulda, rat, and the hiddenness. Section 12. This explains all land species have a parallel in the sea, except for the rat, chulin, 127a. The ultimate hiddenness and concealment is in this world, in the material earth upon which human beings dwell. For the lower the spiritual level, the greater the hiddenness. So of the four fundamental elements fire, air, water, and earth, earth is the lowest of all, in which is the greatest hiddenness. This itself is because that is the dwelling place of human beings, who are creatures with free choice, which is possible only through the greater hiddenness, which is the purpose for which everything was created. That is why there, specifically in the earth, is where the rat dwells. For the rat corresponds to the thick shell that conceals the truth, so specifically in this earth upon which we dwell, in which is the ultimate hiddenness, is the ultimate rectification of revealing the hiddenness specifically through faith in the sages. This is because the element of earth corresponds to faith, as in dwell on the earth and nurture faith. Psalms 37:3. For the four fundamental elements of fire, air, water, and earth correspond to the four worlds of emanation, creation, formation, and action, which correspond to the four-letter of the divine name, which correspond to the three minds, and faith, which corresponds to Malkut. Hence, fire, air, and water correspond to the three minds, and earth corresponds to faith, Malkut. This is why we find that intelligence is compared to fire, air, and water, but never to earth, water, as in, the earth will be filled with intelligence as water covers the seabed, Isaiah 11:9. Air, as in, a spirit of wisdom and understanding, there, verse 2. And, indeed, it is a spirit in the human being, Job 32:8, which refers to human wisdom, and fire, as in, the human soul is a candle of God. Proverbs 2:27, as the Rebbe cites Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 60. But earth only corresponds to faith, for earth is the lowest element upon which are the dwellers of Khaled, in which is the ultimate hiddenness for the sake of free choice. But there too is the ultimate revelation of knowing the truth and recognizing the Creator through faith, mainly through faith in the authentic sages who are devoted to evoking godliness into the world and revealing the truth. That is why the rat is only on dry land, which is the element of earth, for in it is the ultimate hiddenness, which corresponds to a rat, as said. But in water is the beginning of the revelation of intelligence, so the hiddenness is not as great there, for water is spiritually higher than earth, and the higher the level, the less the hiddenness, and the more that intelligence begins to be manifested, which is why intelligence is compared to water, and why rats do not live in water, for the hiddenness in water is not as great. This is also why all purifications from defilements are achieved through water, in which there are no rats, which is the shell of concealment, which corresponds to a rat, which is the first of the 8 non-kosher creeping creatures, which are the source of all defilements, caused by all sins that are caused by the hiddenness. For water corresponds to the revelation of intelligence that emerges from hiddenness to manifestation. This is achieved by strengthening faith in the authentic sages, through which we are able to evoke intelligence and complete strategy to purify ourselves from all filth and all defilement, which corresponds to the pure waters discussed in the lesson, as in, I will sprinkle pure waters on you, and you shall be purified from all defilements. Ezekiel 36:25. Through strengthening faith, we are able to attain a manifestation of intelligence and complete strategy, and to evoke amelioration from the all-encompassing supernal intelligence through having faith in all the holy books of the Torah, through which everything is ameliorated and purified. Section 13. This is the meaning of our sage's teaching. When Rabbi Meir finished the book of Job, he said, "A human being dies and an animal dies. Fortunate is the one who toils in Torah Brachot 17a. Slaughter is to elevate the soul of the living creature from hiddenness to manifestation, which corresponds to the manifestation of intelligence, to know and take deeply to heart that the world is empty and meaningless. As in, listen, all dwellers of Khaled." So Rabbi Meir compares the death of a human being with the slaughter of an animal. For the slaughter of an animal should remind us that the living human being dies, as in, the living will take deeply to heart. Ecclesiastes 7:2, such that one takes deeply to heart and seeks authentic strategies to rescue one's soul, which corresponds to the manifestation of intelligence, which corresponds to the commandment of slaughter. Related to earlier. Listen to this, all nations. Hear this, all dwellers of Kald. Why are all dwellers on earth compared to the rat? One opinion says because all land creatures have a parallel in the sea except for the rat. Another opinion says because it is like the rat that drags and puts down, not knowing for who in the end it is putting down. As written, he collects and does not know for whom he collects. Psalms 39:7. Yerushalmi Shabbat 74b. So now on your own you can understand that both opinions mean the same thing and are not arguing. One says that the reason why the world is called after the rat is because the rat lives only on land, because that is the site of the greatest hiddenness. And the other opinion says because the rat drags and puts down, and so forth, which is itself an expression of the hiddenness, for which reason the entire world is called after the rat. So David cries out, "Listen, all dwellers of Chalad, do not allow yourselves to be fooled by the rat, which embodies the great hiddenness." Notes from an earlier version of The Laws of Slaughter number 5, based on the lesson in Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 61. Section 14. This corresponds to slaughter, which is to elevate the soul of the living creature up to speaking creature, which is the definition of a human being. To elevate the reincarnated souls that have fallen on account of their sins from human being into beasts, animals, and birds. The essence of their fall is on account of a blemish in faith in the sages, on account of which intelligence is blemished. For the putrid vapors confuse the intelligence. And when intelligence is blemished, a person falls from human being to animal, which is a lack of intelligence and a confusion of strategy, as in, a human being will not rest in glory. He has become like animals, silent. Psalms 49:13. Glory corresponds to tefillin, as our sages said, and tefillin is the mind, a clear mind, corresponding to tefillin, requiring a clean body. And whoever blemishes in this is in the category of a human being will not rest in glory. He has become like animals, silent, for now he has fallen into the category of animal. The rectification of ritual slaughter is also to rectify Adam's sin, which was a blemish in faith in the sages, on account of which it was decreed upon him, with sadness will you eat it, with the sweat of your brow, which is a blemish in food, which is the same as above. Therefore, rectification comes through ritual slaughter, for the knife and sword of the slaughter corresponds to dispute, which is called a sword. As written, the wicked have opened a sword, Psalms 37:14, which Rashi explains to mean a dispute. In other words, because the soul blemished in faith in the sages, which is the cause of all dispute, and since it did not repent during its lifetime, then its punishment is to reincarnate into the soul of an animal, where it must bear the pain of slaughter by the sword of slaughter that comes from dispute. That is why the knife must be whole, without the slightest blemish, for God wants to rectify the soul, so the knife must be whole without blemish. And this wholeness is attained through the Torah, in which is the ultimate wholeness, as in God's Torah is complete, restoring the soul. Psalms 19:8, which corresponds to gird your sword on the thigh, there, 45:4, as in each man with his sword on his thigh, Song of Songs 3:8. And the wholeness of the knife is essentially regarding its blade, which cuts the flesh, which corresponds to the completion of strategy, which corresponds to the cutting of the law, which is the ruling of the law, as our sages frequently refer to this as cutting the law. Section 15. This corresponds to the 12 things regarding which the knife is checked, corresponding to Jacob's 12 stones that merged into one. This also corresponds to the measure of a blemish of the knife, being the same as that of a blemish of the altar chulin, 17b, which ameliorates judgment through the Holy of Holies, from where the amelioration and rectification of all sacrificial offerings are evoked. This is why pausing or chopping in the slaughter are forbidden. For though one must not be lax, one must also not be impatient, which is why we need complete strategy without any blemish. This corresponds to chalada, concealment of the knife, as in chulda, a rat, as Rashi explains, as a rat stuck in the holes, Chulin 9a. Listen, all dwellers of Chalad, all land species, have a parallel in the sea, except for the rat. Our sages also said on the verse, He restores the foundation of the house. Your children have made me like a rat that dwells in the foundations of houses. This is very perplexing. However, the existence of the world is dependent upon the hiddenness. For many things are hidden from us, for the ultimate purpose of creation, which was for free choice. And free choice is only made possible by hiddenness. So the most important task is to rise from hiddenness to manifestation. And the lower the level, the more that divine vitality is hidden. This corresponds to the construction and structure of the sanctuary, which was for the purpose of manifesting godliness in order to bring things from hiddenness to manifestation. That is why Moses instructed to first construct the ark, but Bezalel went and first constructed the sanctuary. Moses' task was to evoke amelioration from the Holy of Holies, but for us to be able to enter into holiness, we must begin from below and work ourselves upward. And since the entire slaughter ritual is to elevate from hiddenness to manifestation, which is from living creature to speaking creature, that is why concealment of the knife is forbidden. That is also why one must receive the knife from a Torah scholar. For the ultimate rectification comes through a Torah scholar, through faith in the sages, through a proliferation of books. Related to dwellers of Chaled. It is very strange that everyone on earth should be called dwellers of Chaled because of the rat. Also, why specifically in this psalm, which speaks of the emptiness of this world, is this reference used? However, the main reason why the world is called after the rat is because of the great hiddenness that exists in the world. Just as a rat that dwells in the foundations of houses and waits in hiding in ambush for when it can emerge to steal some food, which corresponds to all earthly affairs, which are all empty, Ecclesiastes 6:11. All this emptiness of this world is on account of the great hiddenness of this world, as written, Ha'olam, the world. He gave into their hearts, there, 3:11, which Rashi explains in the sense Hielim, hiddenness. As our sages said, many things are hidden in the world, the day of death, the day of consolation. What is in another person's thoughts? Pesakim 54b, adding that this is for the perpetuation of the world, for otherwise one would never build a home. But this itself is strange. Would people really not build a home if they knew the day of their death? Furthermore, David himself called out against those who construct houses, as written, their thoughts are that their houses will be forever. Psalms 49:12, and those who construct ruins for themselves. Job 3:14, and many other similar verses. However, all this is for the purpose of free choice, and a human being's main task is to bring things from hiddenness to manifestation, which is impossible to achieve without faith in the sages. Though it is an obvious fact, and everybody knows that this world is utter emptiness, a passing shadow, nevertheless, most people are very attached to the emptiness of this world, wasting their days on this emptiness, and the ultimate hiddenness is caused by financial worries. That is why we need a great tzaddik who will evoke amazing wisdom, and through the revelation of this wisdom, which is attained through the Torah made complete through a proliferation of books, it is possible to evoke the intelligence from the Holy of Holies, from where amelioration is evoked and the truth manifested. Thus, when David spoke in Psalms 49 about the emptiness of the world, as written, their thoughts are that their houses will remain forever. This is their way. Foolishness is theirs. He first began by saying, my mouth will speak wisdom, and the thought of my heart, understanding. For great wisdom is required to uncover this great hiddenness. This entire construction and structure of the sanctuary and temple was for this purpose. For we must evoke this intelligence from the Holy of Holies, which is the very supernal, all-encompassing intelligence. From there, we evoke an amelioration to manifest the hiddenness. That is why Moses instructed to first construct the ark, whereas Bezalel first constructed the sanctuary. This is why every species that exists on land has a parallel in the sea, except for the rat. For the ultimate hiddenness is in this world, in this material earth upon which we dwell. For the lower the level, the greater the hiddenness. There are 4 fundamental elements: fire, air, water, and earth. Earth being the lowest of all, and there the hiddenness is greatest. For that is the dwelling place of creatures with free will, which is dependent upon the hiddenness, and for which everything was created. So there, in the category of earth, is the ultimate hiddenness. That is why, specifically, there lives the rat, which corresponds to a thick shell that conceals the truth. To the one mentioned as the first of the 8 non-kosher creeping creatures, Leviticus 11:29. Thus, there in which is the ultimate hiddenness is the ultimate rectification through faith, which corresponds to earth. But water is higher, in which the manifestation of intelligence begins. These 4 elements, fire, air, water, earth, correspond to the 4 worlds, which correspond to the 4 letters of the name, which correspond to wisdom, understanding, splendor, and kingship, which correspond to the 3 minds, and faith, which corresponds to the kingship. Hence, the very beginning of intelligence is in water, which is why intelligence is compared to water, as in, the earth will be filled with intelligence as water, Isaiah 11:9, as well as to air, as in, a spirit of wisdom and understanding, there, verse 2, and in, a spirit in the human being, Job 32:8, as well as to fire. That is why there are no rats in the sea, for the hiddenness is diminished in water, but other creatures are there, for there is still some hiddenness. However, in air and fire there are not many creatures, since all creatures cause concealment, yet through them comes the manifestation, since the hiddenness is for the purpose of manifestation, which is the essence of free choice. Whoever is able to withstand the temptation and break through the free choice, thereby manifests godliness. Specifically through this, since the hiddenness was so great. Section 16. Now we can understand a bit what our sages said on the verse, "He restores the foundation of the house. Your children have made me like this rat that dwells in the foundations of houses," which Rashi states is caused by Jewish sins. That is, on account of Jewish sins, the hiddenness increases, which corresponds to a rat, the very opposite of constructing a house, as said. That is why, after the sin of the golden calf, the people were instructed to construct the sanctuary out of gold, silver, copper, and so forth. For on account of the great hiddenness that descended after Torah giving, mainly on account of the profuse gold, Hosea 10:2, Deuteronomy 1:1, Brachot 32a. For the greatest hiddenness is caused by the lust for money. God instructed them to bring gold and silver and so forth toward the construction of the sanctuary, through which they would bring hiddenness into manifestation. For the ultimate amelioration comes through the Holy of Holies that was in the sanctuary and the temple. That is why all purification is attained through water, in which there is no rat, and why all purification from the putrid vapors through which we are able to attain complete strategy that will not disappear from us comes through pure waters, which correspond to dispute, which corresponds to the sword of ritual slaughter. Hence, the sword and knife of slaughter corresponds to water, in which there is no rat to conceal the truth, which is the ultimate rectification. That is why Shechitah is forbidden in slaughter. Remember me, I am of child, earth. Psalms 89:48-49. My child, earthly body is as nothing before you, yet all emptiness of every human being endures forever. There, 39:6. A human being's end is death, and an animal's end is slaughter. Fortunate is the one whose toil is in Torah, Brachot 17a. Hence, slaughter reminds of death, which corresponds to bringing the hiddenness into manifestation, which is accomplished mostly through toil in Torah, as in, fortunate is the one whose toil is in Torah. Section 17. This corresponds to the great miracle of Purim, which was the subdual of the evil force of Haman Amalek, which is the essence of the filth of the serpent, a blemish in faith in the sages, which is the greatest cause of the hiddenness and concealment. This is why the book of Esther speaks about Ahasuerus' awesome wealth. Esther 1:6, for the greatest hiddenness is caused by lust for money and wealth. Furthermore, Ahasuerus also caused the Jewish people to sin in fornication, Esther Rabbah 7:13, as well as to partake in his banquet, through which he was empowered to overcome them, as our sages said, Megillah 12a. The miracle took place through Mordecai and Esther. Esther corresponds to the foundation of the house, to the amazing holiness that is hidden and concealed in such intense hiddenness and concealment as, in your children have made me like this rat that dwells in the foundations of houses, meaning that she is hidden within the shell of the rat, the source of all concealments. But because of Esther's great holiness, she overcame them from within the intense hiddenness itself, as in a time when one man ruled over another to his own detriment, Ecclesiastes 8:9, all through the power of Mordecai the Tzaddik, who was also named Petachiah, for he Petach, opened things and explained them. Menachot 65a, specifically, opened, meaning that he opened and revealed the intense hiddenness and concealment through his holy teachings, revealing such amazing Torah lessons with such authentic and deep intelligence, such that he thereby revealed to everyone the great emptiness of this world, shining into people amazing strategies to rescue themselves. This corresponds to, my mouth will speak wisdom, as in the psalm, listen, all dwellers of Chald. This is, the Jewish people had light and joy. Esther 8:16, corresponding to, the light of the tzaddikim makes joyous. Proverbs 13:9, light corresponds to revelation, in contrast to hiddenness and concealment, which corresponds to darkness, and glory is in contrast to, the human being will not rest in glory. Section 18. This corresponds to the Torah reading section of the red heifer that is read after Purim. The Rebbe states that first there was Pur, which transformed into Para, heifer Likutey Moharan, Part 2, 74. But what is the connection between Pur and Para? However, based on what was said earlier, through the Pur, the lot, Haman sought to blemish the lot of Yom Kippur, through which the high priest enters into the Holy of Holies to ameliorate all judgments, which comes about the manifestation of the hiddenness. For all hiddenness is on account of judgments, from which arises the power of the forces of evil to conceal the truth. So Haman sought to cause a blemish in the holy lot of Yom Kippur that Aaron placed on the two goats, which is why when the Jewish people were able to subdue him and attained Purim, so named after the Pur, the lot, they then attained the purification of the red para, heifer. For the red heifer and the goat sent to Azazel are one and the same, for they are both done outside of holiness, and specifically through them is the purification and forgiveness of sins attained. The ritual of the red heifer is to slaughter it directly opposite the entrance to the inner sanctuary, which is the Holy of Holies, in order to evoke amelioration from there, from the Holy of Holies, such that through the great power of the tzaddik to ameliorate the supernal intelligence, which is the amelioration of judgments, the amelioration will be evoked all the way to the outside. Then, amazing strategies will be evoked such that even those standing completely outside will have hope that they will not be lost completely on account of the great intensity of the defilement of death, which conceals the truth very greatly in many countless ways of concealment and hiddenness. But the authentic tzaddik who corresponds to Moses, specifically through whom are achieved all of the rectifications of all the red heifers that were ever made by all the high priests, Rashi, Numbers 19, all of which must be sanctified by the ashes of Moses' original heifer, for only Moses is able to achieve the rectification of the heifer, which is more precious than the service in the Holy of Holies, enters into wherever he enters, until he evokes the amelioration of the supernal intelligence all the way to the outside, to purify all those wallowing outside of holiness on account of their great defilement, which is the defilement of death, which is the greatest of all defilements, purifying them from this greatest defilement. Section 19. Thus, the service of the red heifer comes from an exceedingly exalted and deep intelligence. It is the statute of the Torah, Numbers 19:2, as in, I said I would become wise, but it is distant from me. Ecclesiastes 7:23, as in, deep, deep, who can find it? There, verse 24, as our sages said, I have revealed it to you, but to others it is a statute. Midrash, Tanchuma, Chukat. It is the essence of the totality of all the holy books of the Holy Torah, which are all called after Moses, for it was revealed to him already at Sinai. Every novel idea or authentic book that any established Torah scholar will ever compose. Therefore, only he knows how to evoke amelioration and purification, and an intelligence that will shine literally to the outside. This also corresponds to the service of the lot of Yom Kippur. For through the high priest entering with the blood of the goat that was offered inside, through that he evoked intelligence and amelioration, such that he subdued and dispelled all Jewish sins through the goat that was sent to Azazel. For through the great supernal intelligence he subdued all evil that was literally outside, through which he evoked forgiveness for all Jewish sins. That is the great power of the tzaddik, who corresponds to Moses, who attains the ability to enter and leave to the ultimate supreme wholeness, who is able to enter the place of an extremely hidden and exalted intelligence and evoke from there amazing amelioration. But even more novel is his knowing how to leave and take that intelligence all the way to the outside, to shine by way of this intelligence authentic strategies to all those wallowing in the outside, to reveal the truth even to them, and to bring them from hiddenness to manifestation, to bring them to know the ultimate truth wherever they are, that this world is literally emptiness. Even though they are wallowing in whatever they are wallowing, nevertheless, the truth is the truth. Everyone actually knows this, that the world is empty, a passing shadow. For how can one deny the fact that today a person is here and tomorrow they are in the grave? But on account of the great lusts that conceal, people do not know how to devise strategies for themselves, how to rescue their souls from hell. On account of this, they avoid thinking about it and pursue the emptiness of the world, saying, "What can we do? We are already trapped in whatever we are trapped," and countless other self-deluding arguments, as written, "This is their way, foolishness is theirs." And lest you say they have forgotten about it, Rashi, Psalms 49:14. And they speak about their ends forever. Fat covers their kidneys and prevents them from providing strategies, Brachot 61a. For otherwise they could receive authentic strategies from them. The fat, the lusts of this world, cover them and conceal the truth. But the authentic tzaddik, who corresponds to Moses, evokes intelligence with his deep wisdom from an extremely exalted place, such that he manifests the hiddenness and shines the truth into all those who are literally outside, shining even into them authentic strategies to rescue their souls so that they at least do not perish completely. Section 20. This is, Kohelet sought to find desirable words, words of truth appropriately written, Ecclesiastes 12:10, which our sages explain as referring to seeking to know the mystery of the red heifer as Moses knew it. In other words, repeatedly throughout the book, Kohelet decries crying out very loudly the great emptiness of this world. So he thought that he knows the mystery of the red heifer, as did Moses. So the Holy Spirit responds, words of truth appropriately written, for even if one cries out that the world is emptiness, nevertheless, the only one who is able to truly reveal this hiddenness is someone like Moses, who is able to write words of truth appropriately written to compose authentic books through which the Torah will be completed, through which he evokes intelligence, specifically through which he shines the truth to the outside, which corresponds to the mystery of the heifer that is completely red, which symbolizes very harsh judgments, specifically through which the judgment is ameliorated at its source through the great power of Moses. But Solomon had not attained this, since he said, God is with me and I am able. Proverbs 31. The conclusion is missing. Due to our many sins, the manuscript was lost during the upheavals of the dispute in 5595. Here is a transcription from a handwritten paper written by Rabbi Nathan, the author. The first part of this book on Yoreh De'ah, from Laws of Slaughter, number 5 until Laws of Fish, had already been written, praise to God, but during the time I and we were all very pursued, and I was slandered to the government, as known, this manuscript was lost. May God, in His compassion, restore to us all material and spiritual losses, and silence the dispute against us that is still being carried out for no reason. Those who hate me without cause are more numerous than the hairs on my head, Psalm 69:5, and in return for our love, they despise me, but I am prayer there, 109:4. Laws of Wounded Animals. Law 1. Based on the lesson in Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 19, mentioned in Laws of Slaughter, number 2. Study there. Section 1. This corresponds to the 18 instances of wounded animals, which corresponds to the rectification of the covenant, which corresponds to tzaddik, chai, life, or 18 of the world. Zohar, Part 2, 276b. These mortally wounded animals are forbidden to eat because they were already terminal before the slaughter. As written, this is the living creature that you shall eat. Leviticus 11:2, upon which our sages comment, that which will live you can eat. That which will not live you shall not eat. Chulin 42a, for the realm of death hovers upon such an animal, which corresponds to a blemish in the covenant. This corresponds to this is the animal, specifically this, as written, this is what he spoke, Genesis 49:28, which the Rebbe cites in the lesson. The Jewish people are only allowed to eat that which is this animal, which is from the realm of life, which corresponds to this, which corresponds to the wholeness of the holy tongue, which corresponds to the rectification of the covenant. That is why it is forbidden to eat of the 18 mortally wounded animals so that we attain life, as in tzaddik, chai, life, or 18 of the world. This is the meaning of, you shall not eat flesh from a wounded animal in the field, you shall cast it to the dogs. Exodus 22:30, specifically to the dogs. For a blemish in the covenant is related to the dog, as written, the leech has 2 daughters, give. Proverbs 30:15, as the Rebbe writes in Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 50. When an animal is properly slaughtered by the sword, which corresponds to the wholeness of the holy tongue, and has been ruled kosher after examining that it has no mortal wounds, this animal is then in the category of a sacrificial offering, corresponding to a lion descends from on high to consume the offering, Tikkunei Zohar 140a. But when the animal has been mortally wounded, and the realm of death hovers upon it, which corresponds to a blemish in the covenant, then it should be given specifically to a dog, for in this case, a dog descends from on high, which is the opposite of the multi-bladed sword of holiness, for it corresponds to the bile, which has two mouths. Study there in the lesson. This is why the above verse begins, "You shall be holy people for me. You shall not eat flesh from a wounded animal," for this corresponds to holiness, to the guarding of the covenant, which is why the 18 types of wounds are divided into 8 main categories. Yoreh De'ah 29, corresponding to the rectification of the covenant, which corresponds to 8. This is also why there are actually 70 wounds all told that are non-kosher Maimonides. Laws of Slaughter 10, 9, corresponding to the 70 nations. For we must avoid the 70 wounds in order to be spared from the all-encompassing evil of the 70 nations. Section 2. Thus, the wounds are mostly in the lungs, for that is the main site of the spirit of life that cools the heat, on account of which intelligence, can be rectified. Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 225. And the rectification of intelligence is the rectification of the covenant. This is why there are 5 lobes in the lungs, corresponding to the 5 books of the Torah, the Hay of Hadat, for intelligence is mostly dependent upon that. Thus, the only place in which we must check for any wounds is in the lungs, where wounds are common. Yoreh De'ah 39, for, as a rule, the main power of the forces of evil is only where there is greater holiness. For this reason, they attack the lungs, in which is the main spirit of life and sustaining of intelligence, to cause them wounds, which is why wounds are common in the lungs. This is why an animal remains kosher if the spleen has been removed. Yoreh De'ah 43, for the spleen is the very opposite of the lungs. The spleen is nourished by the befouling of the blood, by the confusion of the intellect, which is the realm of death. So life is not dependent upon the spleen, and the animal remains kosher without it. This is because a wounded animal corresponds to a blemish in the covenant, a blemish in dot, which is why such an animal is called Tereifot, after Tereifot, confusion of intelligence. For a Tereifot corresponds to a blemish in eating, which nourishes foolishness and the confusion of intelligence, as well as idolatry. Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 17. This corresponds to the spleen, which is nourished and empowered mainly by the confusion of intelligence, corresponding to wounds. For the spleen itself is foolishness, as in, the laughter of a fool. Ecclesiastes 7, 6. Idolatry, a foreign god. Zohar, Part 3, 233. Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 23. For the spleen's main power comes from a blemish in eating, as written, "With sadness will you eat it," Genesis 3, 17, which corresponds to an empowerment of the spleen, which is sadness and melancholy, idolatry, a darkened countenance, and the sadness and bitterness of earning a livelihood. All this on account of a blemish in eating, for "with sadness will you eat it" was decreed on account of a blemish in eating, as written, "Was it from the tree that I commanded not to eat that you ate?" There, verse 11. On account that was decreed, "With sadness will you eat it," which is the empowerment of the spleen. For when eating is as it should be, that is, when we avoid eating wounded animals, which is the subdual of foolishness, which corresponds to the spleen, then livelihood comes easily, as in, he provides tereifot, sustenance, for those who fear him. Psalms 111, 5. Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 37. In other words, when the Jewish people avoid Tereifot, then he provides tereifot, for sustenance is ultimately dependent upon the wholeness of intelligence and the guarding of the covenant. Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 11, 23, 29. Thus, most types of wounds in the spleen, such as a hole, a cut, or even completely removed, do not render the animal non-kosher. for the animal's life is not dependent upon the spleen. For on the contrary, the spleen is the realm of death, of foolishness, of idolatry. However, some wounds in the spleen are tereifot, such as if there is a hole on the thick end of it, a minimum amount of tissue, the thickness of a gold coin, remain Yoreh De'ah. 43:2. This is because even foolishness is a necessity in creation, and it must be given a minimum amount of nourishment and vitality. Likutey Halakhot, Part 1. 17. For endurance of intelligence is also dependent upon foolishness, being given some nourishment, however, only a bare minimum for its survival. And this bare minimum is dependent upon the spleen, which embodies foolishness, so therefore a bit of the spleen must remain for the sake of foolishness. This explains why our sages gave the measure of that minimum as the thickness of a gold coin, for that is from where foolishness draws its nourishment and vitality, as in earth of gold, Job 28:6, which corresponds to, "You shall eat earth throughout all of your days," Genesis 3:14. This corresponds to the spleen, which embodies sadness and the worries of earning a livelihood, as in, "With sadness will you eat it," which corresponds to the laughter of the fool, which is the lust for money. All this is mentioned in the Holy Zohar and in Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 23. Earth is cold and dry. Similarly is the spleen. In sum, the spleen corresponds to the lust for gold, to foolishness, idolatry. And though this is the opposite of vitality, nevertheless, a bit of it must be left over for its bare survival. For even foolishness needs to be nourished, for it is also a necessity in creation. This corresponds to the north, which was left open in creation Bava Batra 25b, in order to leave room for the forces of evil, which dwell in the north, as in, "Evil will come from the north," Jeremiah 1:14, which corresponds to earth of gold, as written, "Gold will come from the north," Job 37:22. This is why, even though sacrificial offerings are brought in order to subdue foolishness, nevertheless, foolishness itself is also nourished from the altar, specifically from the smoke of the offering Zohar, Part 2, 130a. That is why the smoke rose toward the north, in order to nourish the forces of evil, as said. This corresponds to the spleen, to earth of gold, to foolishness, which must be given their minimum nourishment. Law 2. Based on the lesson in Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 54. Study the entire lesson. In sum, one must guard memory very carefully to always remember the world of the future. In order to guard memory, one must protect oneself from falling into the evil eye, and even one who has a benevolent eye must guard themselves from the power of imagination. And the power of imagination is caused by the slander, for the power of imagination is the power of animality, and a slanderer is a fool. And when one loses one's intelligence, one falls from love of God and into love of animality, as in, "You have loathed me," Hosea 4:6. Priest corresponds to holy loves, as in, "Abraham who loves me," Isaiah 41:8, and as in, "The priest shall scoop up with him palm," Leviticus 5:12. And the power of imagination is always seeking a vessel that will contain it, which is why it always seeks for someone who studies Torah, for they create all things with their Torah study. This corresponds to, and the repetition of the dream, is because the matter is ready before God, and God is rushing to actualize it. Genesis 41:32. This corresponds to Pharaoh's dream, which is the power of imagination, is one there, verse 25. For it is derived from one, that is, from love, in this case from fallen loves, which corresponds to Zikarim, boys, corresponding to Zikaron, memory, for this had been blemished by the power of imagination, which corresponds to Pharaoh. And subduing the power of imagination is achieved through the hand, that is, through joy, as in, you shall rejoice with all the achievements of your hands. Deuteronomy 12. 7, which corresponds to the playing of musical instruments with the hands, through which prophecy comes to rest upon the prophets, as written, Bring me a musician, 2 Kings 3, 15. This is because the musical instrument is a gathering in of wind and spirit, which is a mixture of good and evil, for there is a spirit of sadness, a broken spirit, an evil spirit, and there are a good spirit, which corresponds to the spirit of prophecy, and the Holy Spirit, and the one who plays the instrument with his hands gathers the good spirit from the spirit of sadness. But to do this, one must know how to play well, for one must go up and down the scales on the instrument one is playing, in order to construct complete joy precisely. And this gathering and constructing of the good spirit is specifically through the hands, because that is where the various spirits are entrusted. As written, In your hand I entrust my spirit, Psalms 31:6. Furthermore, the instrument itself must be flawless, for when the instrument is flawed, then a fool lets out all of his spirit, Proverbs 29:11. And then all of the mixture of good and evil spirit is let out, on account of which the power of imagination is increased, as in, His spirit will go out and return to the earth, Psalms 146:4. This corresponds to, at the end of 2 years, Pharaoh was dreaming, Genesis 41:1, and the rectification of the imagination, which corresponds to Pharaoh, is attained through Joseph, as in, a man in whom is the Spirit of God, there, verse 38, and Joseph will place his hand on your eyes, there, 46:4, for the eye is protected from the power of imagination through Joseph, through his hand. This corresponds to, I will remember my melody at night, Psalms 77:7. Study all this well in the lesson. Section 1. This corresponds to the 18 instances of wounded animals that we, the Jewish people, are prohibited from eating when the living creature has some hole or lacuna in a vital organ. For the living creature corresponds to the power of imagination, the power of animality, and therefore we can only eat flesh from a living creature if it has first been sorted out from the power of imagination, as in, who knows that the spirit of the human being ascends on high, and the spirit of the animal descends below to the earth, Ecclesiastes 3:21. For this is the human spirit and the animal spirit. The human spirit is the holy intelligence, which is the definition of a human being, and the animal spirit corresponds to the power of imagination. And ever since Adam's sin, there is a mishmash in everything in the world, with the human spirit becoming medleyed with the animal spirit. This is the ultimate rectification of holy eating, to sort out the human spirit from the animal spirit, the good from the evil, from the power of imagination. This sorting out is accomplished mainly through melody, which corresponds to joy, for in this way is the good spirit, which corresponds to the human spirit, sorted out from the evil spirit, from the animal spirit, from the power of imagination. This corresponds to the necessity to eat with joy. As written, there is nothing better for the human being than to eat, drink, rejoice, and see good. There, 8:15, and go eat your food with joy. There, 9:7, and you shall eat before your God, and you shall rejoice with all the good. Deuteronomy 14:23, 26, 11. For the ultimate rectification and sorting out of eating is through joy, which corresponds to melody, as in, you shall rejoice with all the achievements of your hands, Deuteronomy 12:7, through which we sort out the good spirit from the wounded spirit, the saddened spirit, which corresponds to the sorting out of imagination, which is the animal lusts, sorting out the good, corresponding to the 7 years of bounty from the 7 years of famine. Section 2. This corresponds to the blessing after meals, specifically to the cup of wine over which we recite the blessing after meals, which has 10 requirements, brachot 51a, which correspond to the 10 types of melody that are all embodied within the cup of blessing, which corresponds to Malchut Pri Etz Chaim, Pesach, chapter 7. Hence, the ultimate rectification and sorting out of eating is through joy, which corresponds to melody. This corresponds to eating on Shabbat and the festivals, which corresponds to holy eating. These times are days of joy, when it is a mitzvah to eat and drink. As stated in the Holy Zohar, there is nothing better for a human being than to eat, drink, rejoice, and see good. Ecclesiastes 8:15. This is the joy of Shabbat and the festivals. Zohar, Part 2, 255a. This is because the ultimate sorting out of eating from the power of imagination, the power of animality, is attained through joy, which corresponds to melody, corresponding to the 7 years of bounty from the 7 years of famine. Therefore, we must not eat flesh from a living creature unless the animal was whole, without any mortal wound in any vital organ, so that the spirit of life will not leave it through that channel. For then the verse would apply, its spirit leaves it and returns to its earth, that the entire medleyed spirit leaves, and the entire imagination is not sorted out. For it is impossible to sort out the imagination other than when the vessel is whole. For then the imagination can be sorted out. The good spirit can be sorted out the human spirit from the animal spirit through melody and joy. Therefore, most wounds are related to the lungs. The lungs need to be checked for all types of wounds. For melody is mainly connected with the lungs, from which the sound of melody emerges. For it is the windpipe through which the sound of melody is given forth. As our sages said, honor God from your throat. Tanchuma Ra'ai, chapter 12. Pesikta Rabati, chapter 25. That is why the lungs have 5 lobes, corresponding to the 5 strings on David's lyre, which correspond to melody, as above. So, the lungs must be checked more than any other organ, for the lungs must be whole, without any lacuna, so that the animal will not be in the category of its spirit will leave it and return to its earth. This is because the lungs are the ultimate instrument, corresponding to the 5 strings of David's lyre, from which all melodies emerge when one's instrument, David's lyre, the lungs, is whole. Then, through the melody, we are able to sort out the human spirit from the animal spirit, which is the sorting out of the imagination, through which proper eating can be attained, through which memory can be guarded. For the guarding of memory is dependent upon the sorting out of imagination, which is dependent upon holy eating. This corresponds to sacrificial offerings, when the Levites would stand on a platform and sing while the offerings were brought. The essence of a sacrifice is to sort out the human spirit, the good spirit, from the animal spirit, which is accomplished through song and melody, as said, as in, "You shall rejoice with all the achievements of your hands," Deuteronomy 12:7, which refers to the offerings that are brought on the festivals. This corresponds to "There is no joy without meat," Pesachim 109a, specifically that of the offerings, for that is the ultimate joy. Since the ultimate sorting out of animality, which is the sorting out of imagination, is through joy and melody, that is why it is obligatory to eat meat on Shabbat and the festivals, for at this time we are able to attain joy, which corresponds to the sorting out and rectification of the animal meat, sorting out the human spirit from the animal spirit. Section 3. This corresponds to ritual slaughter. An animal that has died naturally is a carcass, and the holy Jewish people must not eat it, for we, the holy Jewish people, cannot eat flesh from a living creature upon which rests the power of imagination, the power of animality, unless it has first been sorted out, subduing the evil, which is the spirit of animality, and sorting the good out from it. That is why when the animal dies naturally, and the living spirit leaves it on its own, not through a Jewish person, then the human spirit is not sorted out from the animal spirit, and it is then in the category of its spirit leaves it and returns to its earth. Psalms 146:4-2. Therefore, a Jewish person can only eat flesh from a living creature if it has been ritually slaughtered. For specifically, we must extract the living spirit from the animals in order to then sort out the imagination at the time of the slaughter, sorting out the human spirit from the animal spirit, for only then does it become fitting for Jewish consumption. The knife used by the slaughterer corresponds to the realm of melody, through which imagination is sorted out. For melody comes from the realm of the judgments of Isaac, from the Levites, which correspond to the slaughter knife, which corresponds to the judgments of Isaac. That is why Isaac had to stretch out his neck for the slaughter, as written, Abraham took the knife to slaughter his son. Genesis 22:10. For judgments can only be ameliorated at their root. This corresponds to praises of God in their throats and a multi-bladed sword in their hands. Psalms 149:5. Praises of God in their throats corresponds to melody, for the sound of melody comes through the throat, and a multi-bladed sword in their hands corresponds to the slaughter knife, which corresponds to the judgments of Isaac. That is the source of melody and joy, for which reason Isaac is Yitzchak, a name that means mirth and joy. As written, whoever hears this Yitzchak will rejoice for me. Genesis 21:6, as the Targum translates. Thus, through the slaughter knife, corresponding to the multi-bladed sword, which corresponds to the Malkut, which embodies all of the 10 types of melody, and which corresponds to an avenging sword that avenges the covenant. Leviticus 26:25. We sort out the human spirit from the animal spirit, as in, who knows that the human spirit ascends on high? See also Likutey Moharan, Part 2, 63. That is why the slaughter knife must be complete without the slightest blemish, which corresponds to the wholeness of the vessel, so that we can sort out the good spirit from the wounded spirit. Section 4. Ritual slaughter is carried out at the neck and throat, separate between the head and the body, which correspond to the human spirit, and the animal spirit, which correspond to memory and forgetfulness, to the world of the future, and this world. For the head corresponds to intelligence, which corresponds to memory, to binding one's thought to the world of the future. This is because the intelligence that is in the head knows and remembers well that this world is nothingness, and that the most important thing is the world of the future. For how can anyone refute this? Anyone with a brain, their head knows this very clearly, that there is no purpose at all in this world with its imaginary lusts, and that the most important thing is to bind one's thought to the world of the future. Always remembering the world of the future. The only reason a person forgets this occasionally is on account of the bodily lusts, because forgetfulness is dependent upon the heart. And on account of the lusts of the heart, one forgets the ultimate purpose, which is the world of the future. The head and the body correspond to memory and forgetfulness, since the intelligence that is in the head keeps its distance from the body's lusts. That is why ritual slaughter is done at the neck and throat, which connect the head and the body, which correspond to memory and forgetfulness, to human and animal, and why the ultimate sorting out is accomplished with the slaughter knife that separates between the human spirit that ascends on high, which corresponds to the head, to intelligence, from the animal spirit that descends below, which corresponds to the body, to foolishness. For even an animal embodies all levels, for every level embodies all levels, as known. Thus, the act of ritual slaughter must sever the windpipe, the esophagus, and the vital blood vessels, which correspond to Pharaoh's 3 ministers, Sha'ar HaKavanot, Pesach, one which correspond to the animal lusts, which seek to draw the intelligence of the head into the bodily lusts, to intensify the power of imagination, the power of the body, which corresponds to Pharaoh, as stated in the lesson that Pharaoh corresponds to the power of imagination, and Pharaoh spells Ha'oref, the neck, for Pharaoh's 3 ministers, the windpipe, the esophagus, and the vital blood vessels seek to draw the intelligence into the head, to the power of imagination. That is why we must slaughter and subdue these three ministers of Pharaoh through the act of ritual slaughter at the windpipe, the esophagus, and the vital blood vessels. Thus, sorting out imagination and separating between the intelligence in the head, corresponding to the human spirit, from bodily lusts, animal lusts. This is accomplished with the slaughter knife, which corresponds to the realm of melody, the realm of the Levites. As written, the Levites were in charge of the slaughter of the Pesach sacrifices, 2 Chronicles 30:17. This is why the slaughter must be done specifically with a back and forth movement of the knife Yoreh De'ah, 6 as in, who ascend to heaven and descended, Proverbs 30, 4, which corresponds to melody through which one attains memory, as said earlier. This corresponds to each man with his sword on his hip out of fear in the Night's Song of Songs 3:7, which Rashi explains, so that the Torah would not be forgotten in the exile. For through the sword, which corresponds to the realm of melody, we sort out the imagination, attain clear ruling, and are spared from forgetfulness. Section 5. This corresponds to, you shall not eat flesh from a wounded animal in the field. You shall cast it to the dogs. Do not slander, Exodus 22:30-31, from which our sages derive that one who speaks slander should be cast to the dogs. Pesachim 118a. For the sin of slander and the prohibition of eating from a wounded animal are the same concept. This is because the main power of imagination comes through slander, which itself corresponds to the prohibition of wounded animals. Section 6. This is why there are chai, 18, wounds that render an animal non-kosher, corresponding to tzaddik chai, life of the world. Zohar, Part 2, 276b, which corresponds to Joseph, the tzaddik who guarded the covenant, through whom comes the ultimate rectification of imagination, as in, Joseph will place his hand on your eyes. Genesis 46:4. This is because the sorting out of imagination, to subdue the animal lusts, to sort out the human spirit from the animal spirit, is dependent upon the guarding of the covenant, which corresponds to Joseph, the tzaddik. For the ultimate wholeness of melody and joy is attained through guarding the covenant. Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 27. For that is the main spirit of life, corresponding to Joseph, who is a man in whom is the Spirit of God. Genesis 41:38. As in, no spirit rose up in any man. Joshua 2:11. Section 7. This corresponds to circumcision and uncovering the glands. The foreskin that covers the covenant corresponds to the clouds that cover the eyes, which correspond to forgetfulness, to an evil eye. This is because a blemish in the covenant is a blemish in the eyes, as in, you shall not veer after your hearts, or after your eyes. Numbers 15:39. So the evil eye, corresponding to a blemish in the covenant, to the foreskin that covers the covenant, must be subdued by cutting it off with a multi-bladed sword. Then, after cutting off the foreskin, which corresponds to an evil eye, we must still sort out the imagination, which corresponds to the uncovering of the glands, which is done by tearing the remaining membrane to uncover the glands, through which we sort out imagination. In this way, forgetfulness is subdued, and zikaron, memory which corresponds to the covenant, as in zakar, a male, is increased. That is why the mitzvah of circumcision was accepted by the Israelites with joy. Shabbat 130a. For the ultimate rectification is attained through joy, which corresponds to melody, through which we sort out imagination, and attain memory, which corresponds to priya, uncovering, subduing Pharaoh, who corresponds to the power of imagination. Section 8. This corresponds to Joseph descending to Egypt after being sold by his brothers for slandering them to their father, a sin for which one falls into animality, into the power of imagination. which corresponds to Pharaoh and Egypt. Thus, the brothers slaughtered a he-goat, Genesis 37:31, upon which our sages say that Joseph was stricken with all the things he had said about them, Genesis Rabbah 84:7-4. Even when acting improperly, they slaughtered a goat. He had said about them that they scorned the sons of the maidservants, that they were suspect of partaking of an animal without slaughter, and of having inappropriate sexual relations, all of which are in the same category. Scorning the sons of the maidservants corresponds to slander, for slandering a person is scorning them, which itself corresponds to eating animal flesh without slaughter, which is also the blemish of imagination, and hence they are also suspect of having inappropriate sexual relations, which is a blemish in the covenant, which is a blemish in memory. But the brothers hated him for this, claiming that they are innocent of all this, and that he is just slandering them, for which reason he deserves to be hated, for he is thereby blemishing in holy love, as in, because you have loathed intelligence, I loathe you from serving as my priest, Hosea 4:6. Hence, they hated him even more for his dreams and his words. Genesis 37:8, which refers to his slander, Rashi, on account of which he deserves to be hated. This is, for his dreams and his words. For a dreamer corresponds to imagination. So they were arguing that since he is slandering them, he has thereby fallen into imagination, on account of which his dreams, which come from imagination, are not true, and he therefore deserves to be hated. That is why they sold him to Egypt, the dominion of Pharaoh, who corresponds to imagination, and why specifically then they slaughtered a he-goat to show that they are innocent of eating without slaughter. For their imagination is clarified and rectified, which corresponds to slaughter. But through withstanding temptation and guarding the covenant for the ultimate sorting out of animal lusts is by breaking this lust, which is the ultimate animal lust. Joseph, in his great righteousness, broke this lust, on account of which he was able to sort out imagination even in Egypt, in a place of its most intense dominion, for Egypt is the lewdness of the earth. Genesis 42:9-12. That is why Joseph was able to interpret dreams, which corresponds to sorting out imagination. For a dream comes through imagination, and on account of a confused imagination, we do not know its true interpretation. But Joseph, who had rectified and sorted out imagination, was thereby able to know the true interpretation of the dreams. That is why Joseph had to interact with Pharaoh's 3 ministers, the butcher, the butler, and the baker, first serving them, Genesis 40:4, for he had to subdue these 3 who intensify imagination. He indeed subdued them in the place of their greatest power, but because he relied on them, 2 years were added to his bondage. This is, the butler did not remember Joseph and forgot him there. Verse 23 specifically, did not remember, for they corresponded to forgetfulness that comes from imagination that is intensified by these 3. But Joseph had the power to sort them out by interpreting their dreams, though they themselves remained distant from memory, to forgetfulness. And after Joseph served his punishment of another 2 years, he was able to sort out everything, which is, at the end of 2 years, Pharaoh dreamt. Pharaoh, who is the imagination. Joseph was then elevated and brought before Pharaoh and interpreted his dreams, thus subduing and sorting out imagination. For the ultimate rectification of imagination is attained through Joseph the Tzaddik, as in, Joseph will place his hand on your eyes, as said earlier. Thus, when his brothers came down, it is said, Joseph remembered the dreams, specifically remembered, for the dreams of the righteous Joseph, who rectified and sorted out imagination, correspond to memory. Section 9. This corresponds to an animal that has been torn apart by a beast of prey. The word for forbidden wounded animals, Tereifot, is from the root of taraf, which means to tear apart, in that the animal was preyed upon by a wild beast, and the tearing apart is done mainly by with the paws and claws. This tearing apart is facilitated by the poison that these beasts of prey possess in their paws and claws, which comes from their great anger, and anger comes from foolishness. As written, anger rests in the bosom of fools. Ecclesiastes 7:9. As the Rebbe writes, Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 61. Hence, these wild beasts whose anger is so great that their paws and claws are poisoned to kill, possess great foolishness, which is an intense power of animality, a power of imagination, which corresponds to foolishness. For the more anger the beast possesses, the more foolishness is also there, which is the power of animality. That is why these beasts render an animal forbidden by their tearing it apart specifically with their paws and claws, their hands, because each thing has its opposite. Just as in holiness, the ultimate sorting out of imagination is attained through the hand, for that is where all spirits are stored. So, on the other extreme, beasts of prey, in which animality and foolishness are so intense, transmit their poison, which corresponds to an evil spirit, to anger and hatred, specifically through their hands. For that is where their evil spirit, which corresponds to anger and hatred, rests, just as the Holy Spirit rests in the human hand. That is why an animal, beast, or bird that have been torn apart by the paws and claws of beasts of prey are forbidden for us to eat. For on account of these beasts of prey has the evil of imagination, which corresponds to their poison, which is the evil spirit specifically in their hands, been intensified. This is why we are very stringent regarding an animal that has been torn apart, for the ultimate rectification of an animal is through the sorting out of imagination, which is accomplished specifically when the animal is free of all types of wounds, in which case it can be sorted out through joy and melody. Section 10. That is why we must give priestly gifts to the priest from a slaughtered animal in order to thereby bind the animal to the priest, which corresponds to holy love, as in, the priest shall kamatz, which corresponds to the sorting out of imagination, in that we sort out and elevate fallen loves from animality and bind them to their root in holy love, which corresponds to a priest through the priestly gifts that we give to the priest. Law 3. Regarding the 18 types of wounds. The Rebbe writes in Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 50, that there are sweet waters that correspond to the guarding of the covenant, and there are bitter waters that correspond to a blemishing of the covenant. When a dog descends to eat one's offering, and eating is in place of offerings, as our sages said, one's table atones as the altar. Brachot 55a. That is why one's table must be whole, without any of the chai, 18 wounds, for these wounds correspond to a blemish in the covenant, which is tzaddik chai, life of the worlds. Zohar, Part 2, 276b. Which is why, regarding a wounded animal, it is said, "You shall cast it to the dog." Exodus 22:30. For then a dog descends to eat it. This connects to what the Rebbe writes at the end of the lesson regarding a Torah student who should eat his prayer, which does not seem to have any connection. However, since eating is in place of offerings, and when one does not eat properly, then a dog descends, therefore the animal must be whole, without any of the chai, 18, wounds. And then the food ascends with holiness and merges into the tzaddik chai, life of the worlds. And then a lion descends to eat one's offering. Therefore the wounds are mainly in the lungs, for the lungs correspond to the guarding of the covenant, which is the guarding of the intellect, as the Rebbe writes in Likutey Moharan, Part 1, 225. For the hydration and fat of the body are sustained by the lungs, through which the marrow of the bones is sustained, which corresponds to sweet waters, as in, all of my bones will declare Psalms 35:10, as explained in the lesson. This is, you shall be holy people to me, and you shall not eat flesh in the field. Exodus 22:30. For wherever a barrier before lewdness is found, there you find holiness. Leviticus Rabbah 24:6. for avoiding the 18 wounded animals corresponds to guarding the covenant, which is why we are then called holy people. Laws of wounded animals number 4 is included in Laws of Ritual Slaughter number 4, 9. Laws of Wounded Animals number 5 was lost, as stated after Laws of Ritual Slaughter number 5. Laws of Priestly Gifts. Law 1. Based on the lesson in Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 17, mentioned in Laws of Wounded Animals, Law 1. Section 1. In order to fully rectify eating so that it will be completely kosher, as appropriate, we must give priestly gifts, which corresponds to giving charity, through which eating is rectified. Furthermore, charity is the wholeness of intelligence and the rectification of the covenant, as in, charity saves from death. Proverbs 10, 2, which is why we give the charity the gifts to the priest, for the priest corresponds to the rectification of the covenant. Therefore, through the gifts that we give, the animal is rectified and made kosher, for its rectification is dependent upon the rectification of the covenant laws of ritual slaughter, Law 2. Our sages similarly said that the gifts of the forearm, the jaws, and the maw, Deuteronomy 18, 3, are given to the priests because Pinchas zealously avenged a blemish in the rectification of the covenant chulin, 134b. So the gifts thus correspond to the rectification of the covenant through which the animal is rectified. Therefore, the gifts are only from animals, because the spirit of animality is greatest in animals, so we must give the gifts to subdue it. Section 2. The priest also corresponds to a Torah scholar and teacher who embodies many Jewish souls, as written, "The lips of a priest guard intelligence, and they will seek Torah from his mouth," Malachi 2, 7, upon which our sages say, if the teacher is like an angel of God, then seek Torah from him, Moed Katan, 17a. Therefore, the rectification of kosher eating is through the charity that we give specifically to the priest, for the rectification is mainly dependent upon the charity that we give to a tzaddik who embodies many souls. This is why the covenant of priesthood, the gifts that the priests are given, is called the covenant of peace, as stated when Pinchas was promised the gifts. I hereby give him my covenant of peace, and it shall be for him and for his descendants after him a covenant of eternal priesthood. Numbers 25:12. For the priests increase peace, since they are tzaddikim, who embody many souls, and through whom peace is increased. This is why one must not give the priestly gifts to a Torah-ignorant priest, for the status of the priests is mainly on account of their holiness, since they are assumed to be more holy than the rest of the Jewish people. Therefore, charity should be rightfully given mainly to them, setting a portion of the abundance of food toward the priestly gifts, in order to thereby rectify the eating. For the rectification of eating is dependent upon giving charity to one who is holier, who embodies more souls, through which peace is increased, specifically through which eating is rectified, which corresponds to the rectification of the altar. This is why it is written regarding the priestly gifts, it is a salary for you in return for your service. Numbers 18:31, meaning that since the priests are fully devoted to the service, which is the rectification of the altar, therefore the gifts, for through that will the rectification of the altar be even greater. Section 3. Furthermore, it is stated in Likutey Halakhot, Part 137, that charity corresponds to the rectification of ritual slaughter, for through this one attains sinless breath, which is the ultimate rectification of ritual slaughter, elevating the soul from living creature to speaking creature, which corresponds to the priestly gifts, to charity. That is why the gifts are only given in the land of Israel, for charity is mainly in the land of Israel, since through charity for the land of Israel, one merges into pure air, corresponding to sinless breath, which is the rectification of ritual slaughter. Also, charity for the land of Israel brings about a greater rectification of the altar, rectification of eating, since the land of Israel is pure air, which corresponds to pleasant and clear air. And when one gives charity to a priest, the air is purified even greater, through which the altar eating is rectified, as the Rebbe writes in Likutey Halakhot, Part 1, 17. Law 2. Section 1. Regarding the connection between Pinchas's zealousy against Zimri's disgraceful act and the priestly gifts given specifically from animals, that the priestly gifts are in return for Pinchas's zealousy against Zimri's act. In Likutey Halakhot, Part 2, 8, it is said that when intelligence is damaged, sexual lust increases, and then we need a powerful one who can pray a prayer of judgment, as Pinchas did when he was zealous against Zimri's act, as written, Pinchas arose and prayed. Psalms 106. 30. He made an accounting with his maker, Sanhedrin 44a, 82b. This is because this prayer of the powerful one that corresponds to judgment gets stuck in the throat of the forces of evil, as in, might rests in his throat. Job 41. 14, which causes it to vomit up all of the holiness and intelligence that it has swallowed, which arouses foreigners to convert, as in, Jethro heard. What did he hear? Exodus 18:1. Study all this there well. Section 2. This corresponds to ritual slaughter, which is to subdue the spirit of animality. An animal, corresponding to the spirit of animality, lacks intelligence, corresponding to foolishness, and it is therefore forbidden for us to eat meat without subduing the spirit of animality, which is the blemish of intelligence, which corresponds to the blemish of lust mentioned above, which is the lust of animality. For this we need prayer as judgment of the powerful one, as mentioned above. This corresponds to the slaughter knife, which corresponds to prayer as judgment, as in, the praises of God in their throat and a double-edged sword in their hand. Psalms 149, 6. Therefore the slaughter is at the place of the neck, as in, might rests in his throat. For through the slaughter, which is by means of the knife, by means of the double-edged sword, which corresponds to prayer, as judgment, through this we subdue the spirit of animality, which is the blemish of intelligence, the blemish of lust mentioned above. For the knife, which corresponds to the prayer mentioned above, stands in the throat of the other side, which corresponds to the blemish of intelligence, the aspect of animality. And through this we extract from it all the holinesses that it swallowed, as in, he swallowed might and vomited it up, and so forth, as explained there in the lesson mentioned above. Section 3. It follows that the slaughter corresponds to prayer, as judgment of the powerful one mentioned above, corresponding to, and Pinchas arose and prayed, as mentioned above. Therefore, after the slaughter we must give from the animal to the priest the forearm, the jaws, and the maw, all of which are on account of the act of Pinchas, as our sages of blessed memory said, as mentioned above. For it is impossible to eat the flesh of the animal except through the act of Pinchas, who was zealous against the act of Zimri, which is the lust of adultery, which is the spirit of animality. The lust of animality, and whose main power to subdue this was through prayer as judgment, as in, and Pinchas arose and prayed, which corresponds to the rectification of slaughter through the double-edged sword at the place of the neck, as mentioned above. Therefore, in return for the acts of Pinchas, we must give from the animal to the priest the forearm, the jaws, and the maw. For the main rectification of the animal, that is, subduing the spirit of animality, so that only then it is fit for Jewish consumption, is through the aspect of Pinchas, as in, and Pinchas arose and prayed, as mentioned above. And through giving the forearm and the jaws to the priest, and the priest corresponds to loving kindness, corresponding to the rectification of holy intelligence, which corresponds to compassion and loving kindness. As explained there, through this we extract the intelligence from the other side, through the act of Pinchas, who took a spear and arose and prayed, and so forth, that is, the aspect of prayer as judgment, as mentioned above. And we extract the intelligence and all the holinesses from the other side, and return everything to holiness, to holy intelligence and compassion, which corresponds to the priest as mentioned above. Section 4. This corresponds to what is stated regarding Jethro, when he came to Moses to draw close to God, blessed be he, and to convert. And Jethro took a burnt offering and sacrifices, and so forth. Exodus 18:12, and sacrifices specifically. For the main aspect of converts is through sacrifices, corresponding to slaughter, which corresponds to prayer as judgment through which converts are made, as mentioned above. Section 5. This corresponds to what Isaac said to Esau, "Take, I pray you, your weapons," and so forth. And our sages of blessed memory expounded, "Check your knife, and slaughter well," and so forth. For Isaac's entire desire was to return Esau to holiness, for he saw that there was prey in his mouth, Genesis 25:28, that there were many holy sparks in him, as is known. Therefore he wanted to convert him. Therefore he said to him, "Take, I pray you, your weapons, check your knife, and slaughter well," and so forth, for through this specifically, converts are made, as mentioned above. And Rebekah heard the word of Isaac, and so forth, and she knew the truth, that he was completely wicked, and it was impossible to convert him by himself. Therefore she commanded Jacob, that Jacob specifically should do this. And he went and brought 2 kids of goats, Genesis 27:9, and he rectified them through the slaughter, and made from them offerings one he offered for Passover, and so forth. Therefore he clothed himself in Esau's garments, as written, and Rebekah took the garments of Esau, and so forth. Genesis 27:15. For Jacob had to extract all the holiness, and all the bounty, and all the blessings from Esau, for Esau wanted to take them all for himself, through the strong judgments of Isaac, in which he was rooted. Therefore Jacob had to use the prayer as judgment, which corresponds to clothing himself in Esau's garments, which correspond to judgments, and to subdue him specifically through that, as Isaac said, "The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau." Genesis 27:22. For Isaac understood that this act comes from Jacob, which in fact is compassion and loving kindness, that is only clothed in a garment of judgment that is not his own, in order to thereby subdue. Esau, who embodies the forces of evil, as in, he swallowed might and vomited it up. That is why Jacob received all the blessings from Isaac specifically then. For all this was accomplished through the rectification that Jacob had achieved through prayer as judgment, through which he extracted all the holiness from Esau, from the forces of evil. So then all bounty and all blessings came to Jacob, as written there, "May God give you from the dew of heaven." Thus, specifically then, it was said, "Behold, the fragrance of my son is as the fragrance of the field," which our sages explain as meaning that the fragrance of the Garden of Eden had entered with Jacob, Genesis Rabbah 65:22, which came about through prayer as judgment of the powerful one, as explained well in the lesson. Since Jacob had then used this prayer, through which he attained the fragrance of the Garden of Eden. Section 6. That is why the slaughter of a non-Jew renders the animal a carcass. The rectification of ritual slaughter, which is achieved through prayer as judgment, cannot be done by a non-Jew, for this requires a very powerful one who is able to carry out this rectification of prayer as judgment. The non-Jews are from the realm of harsh judgments, and not only are they unable to subdue the realm of evil and judgments, but they even cause an intensification of judgment and the realm of evil, which is the root of the non-Jews. That is why Rebekah did not want that Esau should prepare the delicacies for Isaac, for she knew that it would be impossible for him to make this rectification with the slaughter knife, which corresponds to prayer as judgment, but would even cause an intensification. The entire Jewish people, though, are all in the category of powerful ones, as in mighty ones, who carry out his word. Psalms 103:20. And therefore, they are able to rectify and subdue the spirit of animality, the lack of intelligence, through the slaughter knife, which corresponds to prayer as judgment of the powerful one. That is why the ritual slaughterer must be well versed in the laws and has established his skill. Well versed in the laws is the wholeness of intelligence, in that he must possess full intelligence so that he is able to rectify the blemish in intelligence, which corresponds to animality. He must also be a powerful one, so that he is able to rectify the animal through the slaughter knife, which corresponds to prayer as judgment, which corresponds to establishing his skill that he will not faint, which corresponds to a powerful one. Only then is he able to rectify and sort out the spirit of animality. This arouses converts, through which we attain the melody that will be aroused in the future, through which grow all the fragrances and awes that nourish the soul and subdue the nourishment of the body, as in Jacob's hand held onto to Esau's heel, Genesis 25:26. That is why specifically through the slaughter, which corresponds to the rectification of the powerful one, are we allowed to eat from the animal, for then the soul nourishment is increased and the animal becomes worthy to be Jewish food. Jewish food must be in the category of soul nourishment and not body nourishment, for body nourishment corresponds to Esau, to poor me, there, 30, while soul nourishment, which is holy eating, corresponds to a tzaddik eats to his soul's satiation, Proverbs 13:25, which corresponds to Jacob subduing Esau, as in his hand held onto. Through this rectification of the powerful one, who prays a prayer as judgment, which corresponds to ritual slaughter. Laws of priestly gifts, Law 3, in laws of ritual slaughter, Law 4, and in laws of eggs, Law 3.